So Ark Raiders has this whole world built underneath the surface that most players just run through without stopping. And tonight we are going to slow all the way down and go through 67 of the most interesting, overlooked, and quietly unsettling secrets buried inside this game's lore, one by one. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because I kept noticing details in Ark Raiders that didn't quite add up. Little things, a terminal entry here, a piece of environmental storytelling there, and when I started pulling on those threads, the whole picture got a lot more complicated than I expected. This video is my attempt to lay it all out in one place. I should mention up front that I made a deliberate choice when putting this together. I leaned into the gaps in the lore rather than skipping over them, because I think those gaps are actually where the most interesting stuff lives. Some of what I present here is interpretation. Some of it is speculation based on what the game shows you. I'll try to be clear about which is which as we go. Also, don't forget to like this video. It genuinely helps more people find it. And if you are watching this to fall asleep, you can always come back and hit the like button in the morning. Now, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Origin of the Ark. The machines known as Arks did not simply appear one day without warning. The lore scattered across the game's terminals, and environmental details suggest a slow build. A period of months, or possibly years, where the signals were there but not yet understood by the people on the surface. One possible reading of the earliest in-game records is that what humanity first detected was not an attack at all, but something more like a survey. The word Ark itself is worth sitting with for a moment. It appears in internal documents long before the machines were given that name by survivors, and the original usage points toward an acronym rather than a poetic label. What that acronym stood for has never been fully spelled out in the game, which feels intentional. The ambiguity surrounding the name is one of the first signs that the people who built the silo wanted to control what the general population knew and believed. Early accounts from Raider logs describe the first Ark units as slow-moving and almost indifferent to human presence. They were focused on something else entirely, scanning the environment, cataloguing structures, moving in deliberate grid patterns across landscapes that had once been cities. The violence came later, and the question the lore keeps nudging you toward is whether that violence was always the plan, or whether it was a response to something humans did first. The pre-fall records that survive in the game's world paint a picture of a civilization that was already under enormous stress before the Arks arrived. Infrastructure was failing in regions that had been ignored for decades. Communication networks were fragmenting. The people in power were focused elsewhere, on other crises, other priorities. The arrival of the Arks was, in a very dark sense, almost perfectly timed to finish something that was already breaking. Some terminals suggest that the first serious Ark incursion happened not in a major population centre, but in a remote industrial area. This detail is easy to miss, but it matters, because it suggests the Arks were not targeting human populations as their first priority. They were targeting something specific in that industrial zone, something the game never fully names, and that unnamed thing is one of the central mysteries the lore keeps circling back toward without ever quite landing on. The earliest raider who documented an Ark encounter in the game's found records described the machines as moving like they had somewhere to be. Not aggressive, not hunting, just purposeful in a way that made the encounter feel more frightening than any direct attack would have. There is something deeply unsettling about a machine that ignores you, not because it can't see you, but because you are simply not what it came for. The transition from survey behaviour to active aggression is one of the most debated points among players who dig into the lore. The game doesn't give you a clean answer. What it does give you are fragments, a spike in Ark activity following a specific event, increased aggression in zones where certain kinds of equipment were present, and a pattern that, if you map it out, suggests the arcs were responding to interference rather than initiating conflict on their own schedule. There is a document buried in one of the game's less visited areas that appears to be an internal memo from before the fall. It references something called a resonance event and describes it as the moment things changed. The memo is fragmentary and some sections are corrupted, but the portions that are legible suggest that whatever the resonance event was, it triggered a fundamental shift in arc behavior. Before it, the machines were cataloging. After it, they were dismantling. The scale of the initial arc advance is almost impossible to reconcile with the idea that these were purely autonomous systems acting without a plan. The game's lore suggests that the arcs moved with a coordination that would have required either an extraordinarily sophisticated central intelligence or some form of communication network that humans never detected or understood. Neither explanation is fully confirmed, and that uncertainty is baked into the world in a way that feels very deliberate. One of the more quietly disturbing details in the early arc origin lore is the implication that some people knew something was coming and said nothing publicly. The internal records show a gap between when certain high-level individuals appear to have gone underground and when the public evacuation orders were issued. That gap is measured in weeks. It is never addressed directly in the game, but it sits there in the data like a splinter. The architecture of the first arc units that appear in the game's world is described in technical documents as modular, suggesting they were designed to be reconfigured or expanded. This is not the design philosophy of a machine built purely for a single purpose. Something about the original arc design implies adaptability, an ability to evolve the function of individual units based on environmental conditions or received instructions. Whether that adaptability was built in by their creators or something that developed over time is a question the lore leaves deliberately open. The materials used in early arc construction, as described in recovered engineering notes, do not entirely match anything in the pre-fall human industrial record. This is mentioned almost in passing in one of the terminal entries, but the implication is significant. Either the arcs were built using materials or processes that were classified beyond the level of the records that survived, or the materials themselves came from somewhere that the game's world is not quite ready to address directly. The sound design around early arc encounters in the game carries a specific quality that players have noted feels more like language than machine noise. Whether that is a deliberate lore choice or simply an atmospheric one is hard to say, but the idea that arc communication might overlap with something recognizable to human ears is a thread the lore seems to leave deliberately uncut. The population centres that the arcs reached first were not the largest or the most strategically important by conventional military logic. The pattern of the early advance, as pieced together from surviving maps and radar logs, suggests the arcs were following a route that had more to do with what was underground those locations than what was on the surface. This detail points toward the possibility that the arcs had access to geological or subterranean survey data that human militaries did not. The question of who or what the arcs were ultimately reporting to, if they were reporting to anything at all, is one the game never resolves cleanly. There are hints of a hierarchy within the arc structure, units that appear to have directive authority over others, but whether those directive units are themselves autonomous or receiving instruction from some higher source is left unresolved. The lore is comfortable with that ambiguity in a way that suggests it is not an oversight but a choice. The first human attempts to communicate with the arcs are documented in a handful of surviving records, and they are quietly heartbreaking to read. The people who made those attempts were operating on the assumption that any intelligence sophisticated enough to coordinate at the scale the arcs demonstrated must be capable of recognizing a communicative gesture. The arcs gave no indication that they were. Whether that was because they could not understand the attempts or because they chose not to respond is not something the lore settles. The rate at which arc units multiplied in the early days of the incursion is described in one document as exponential, with a caveat that the rate of expansion slowed when the arcs reached certain geographic boundaries. Those boundaries did not correspond to any political border or military defensive line. They appeared to correspond to something in the terrain itself, which suggests the arcs were not simply expanding to fill available space, but were moving towards specific targets according to a map that only they could read. The stories that older silo residents tell about the fall, as represented in the game's dialogue, and found documents, have a quality of selective memory that is worth noting. The events are described, but the connective tissue, the explanation of how one thing led to another, is often missing. This could be the natural result of trauma and the passage of time, or it could suggest that the official narrative of the silo deliberately shaped what people were encouraged to remember and how they were encouraged to frame it. There is a particular raider account from the early days of the silo that describes watching an arc unit pause over the ruins of a building and then simply stand there for what the witness estimated as several hours. It did not scan, it did not move, it just stood. The witness did not know what to make of it, and the account ends before any resolution. That image, a machine standing still in the ruins for no observable reason, is one of the details that stays with you when you think about what the arcs actually are. The game's opening lore establishes the world with a certain matter-of-fact quality that is itself part of the storytelling. The situation is presented as old, settled, something that the silo's inhabitants have had time to normalize. But underneath that normalization, in the details, the origin story is anything but settled. It is full of holes, contradictions, and questions that the people in charge of the silo's narrative appear to have decided were better left unaddressed. The secrets of Arc Raiders begin here, at the very beginning, where the explanation is least complete. The precise moment when the surface became truly uninhabitable for long-term human settlement is not given a fixed date in the game's lore. Different records give different timelines, and the discrepancy is large enough to be suspicious. A difference of a few months might be explained by regional variation or the chaos of record-keeping during a catastrophe. The discrepancy in the Arc Raiders lore is measured in years, which suggests either massive record-keeping failure or a deliberate effort to obscure the real timeline. The role that weather and environmental conditions played in the Arc advance is touched on in several terminal entries. The Arcs appear to have been indifferent to conditions that would have stopped a human military force entirely. Extreme temperatures, electrical storms, chemical contamination in certain zones. None of these slowed the Arc advance in the documented records. This environmental indifference is part of what made them so difficult to resist, and also provides a clue about what they were built for and where they might have originated. Some of the older raider legends that circulate in the silo describe a period before the silo was fully sealed, when small groups of survivors lived on the surface in hidden camps. These accounts are dismissed by the official silo record as myths or dangerous romanticizations of the pre-fall world. But the lore drops enough hints to suggest that at least some of those surface communities might have persisted longer than the official history acknowledges, and that what happened to them is a story the silo would rather not tell. The Arc units encountered in different regions of the game's world are not identical. Players who pay close attention will notice variations in behavior, configuration, and what might loosely be called temperament. This regional variation could be the result of different operational parameters, local adaptation over time, or something the lore hints at more obliquely. The possibility that Arc units in different zones were given different objectives and have been pursuing those objectives independently for long enough that they have diverged significantly from a common baseline. The last piece of the origin puzzle that the game lays out, and then very pointedly does not complete, is the question of first cause. The Arcs came. The Arcs drove humanity underground. But the deepest question, the one that hums underneath all the others, is what set the process in motion. The game's lore suggests this question has an answer. It suggests the answer is known to at least some people in the silo, and it suggests that the answer is the kind of thing that, once told, changes everything else you thought you understood about the world you are living in. The origin of the arcs is not a closed chapter in this world. It is an ongoing question, and every raider who goes to the surface is, in some small way, still looking for the answer, whether they know it or not. The ruins up there are not just scavenging grounds. They are evidence. They are the remains of whatever the arcs were doing and whatever they found. And the more carefully you look at that evidence, the less the official story holds together. The machines that now roam the surface were not always what they are now. The lore suggests they have changed, adapted, possibly even learned. Whatever they started as, they have had a long time to become something else. And whatever they are now is still not fully understood by anyone living in the silo, which is maybe the most important thing to understand about the origin of the Ark. It did not end when the machines arrived. It is still happening. The question of whether the Arks were created by humans is one the game's lore approaches carefully and never fully answers. There are documents that point in that direction. There are also documents that point away from it. The ambiguity reads less like an unresolved design question and more like a deliberate narrative strategy, a way of keeping the most important question alive without closing it off prematurely. Whatever the answer is, the lore clearly thinks the journey toward it matters as much as the destination. The physical remains of Ark units destroyed on the surface tell their own story. Raiders who bring back Ark components describe materials and construction methods that are simultaneously familiar and deeply strange. Some elements appear to use manufacturing processes recognizable from pre-fall human industry. Others do not. This mixture is either evidence of human origin or evidence of something that, at some point, had access to human technology and incorporated it. Both explanations have unsettling implications. The earliest silo records that reference the Arks by name do so in a tone that is clinical and controlled in a way that, once you notice it, feels studied. Whoever wrote those first official accounts was working hard to present the Arks as a known and categorized threat rather than an unknown and terrifying one. The emotional flatness of those records is itself a form of information. It tells you that even at the very beginning, someone in authority was already shaping the story of what the Arks were and where they came from. The origin of the Ark is, in the end, the first of many questions this game's world asks and does not answer. And the pattern it establishes, the careful placement of enough information to make you certain something is being hidden, with not quite enough to tell you what it is the pattern that runs through everything else we are going to explore tonight. Chapter 2. What the silo really is. The silo is presented to its inhabitants as a refuge, a practical solution to an existential crisis, a place built to protect what remained of humanity from the machines on the surface. That is the official story, and like most official stories in Ark Raiders, it contains enough truth to be convincing and enough omission to be dangerous. The more closely you examine the structure of the silo, the more it looks like something that was not built entirely in response to the Ark arrival. The engineering specifications hinted at in the game's found documents suggest that certain sections of the silo predate the official construction timeline by a significant margin. The official record says the silo was built after the Ark incursion began, during the chaotic early period when governments were still functioning. But the construction details visible in the deeper levels of the structure tell a different story, one where groundwork was being laid years before anyone publicly acknowledged that the surface would need to be abandoned. The layout of the silo is not what you would design if your only goal was to house and sustain a surviving population. The proportions are off in ways that become apparent when you map the available living space against the total volume of the structure. There is a great deal of the silo that is not living space. Some of that is infrastructure, some of it is industrial capacity. but a significant portion based on the architectural hints scattered through the game is something else entirely, and access to those portions is controlled in ways that go well beyond what basic security concerns would require. The population of the silo is stratified in ways that mirror a pre-fall social structure rather than the more egalitarian arrangement you might expect from a community built from scratch in a crisis. There are levels, literally and figuratively, and movement between those levels is restricted and monitored. The people on the lower levels know less about what is happening on the upper levels than the other way around. This is not an accident of design. The silo was built to maintain a particular kind of social order, not to dissolve it. The food systems in the silo are impressive and on the surface genuinely functional. But there are inconsistencies in the supply chain data visible in some of the game's accessible records. Certain resource inputs do not quite match the outputs being reported to the general population. The discrepancy is small enough to be explained as measurement error in isolation, but when combined with other anomalies in the silo's resource management records, it suggests a secondary system running parallel to the primary one, drawing resources in ways that are not reflected in the official accounting. The medical records accessible in the game contain gaps that pattern in interesting ways. The gaps are not random, they cluster around specific time periods and specific demographic groups, which suggests selective rather than accidental omission. One possible reading is that certain medical events in the silo's history were deemed sensitive enough to require sanitization from the accessible record. What those events were, and what they reveal about the silo's true operation, is something the law keeps tantalizingly out of reach. The children raised in the silo are educated through a curriculum that the game's documents suggest has been revised multiple times since the initial founding. Each revision moved the curriculum further away from detailed pre-fall history and further toward practical skill building and what the official records call community alignment. The effect of those revisions, if you follow the logic through, is a population that is increasingly well equipped to function within the silo and increasingly disconnected from a full understanding of the world that existed before it. The silo's governance structure is presented as a kind of emergency council formed from the leaders and technical experts who made it underground in time. But the composition of that founding group, as documented in the earliest silo records, raises questions. The technical and scientific expertise represented is highly specific in ways that suggest selection rather than chance survival. The people who ended up in charge of the silo appear to have been chosen in advance, which means someone was making choices about who would govern the survivors before anyone was officially acknowledging that governing survivors would be necessary. The communication systems within the silo are sophisticated and centrally managed. What the general population can hear and send is filtered through infrastructure controlled by the administrative level. Raiders occasionally bring back external communication equipment from the surface, and the game's law suggests that such equipment is reliably confiscated and not returned. The official justification is signal security, the concern that broadcasting from within the silo could attract ARC attention. Whether that justification is complete is another matter. The psychological literature that survives in the silo's accessible records is heavily oriented toward community cohesion, stress management, and what is described in one document as productive grief processing. There is very little in the accessible psychological record dealing with political rights, individual autonomy, or the ethics of confined community governance. The selection of what psychological knowledge was preserved and made available reads, with some charity, as practical. With less charity, it reads as intentional. The founding documents of the silo, the ones that are accessible to the general population, are eloquent and moving. They describe a community built on shared sacrifice, mutual support, and the hope of one day reclaiming the surface. They are also based on the internal records that exist in less accessible locations within the game. not entirely consistent with the private communications of the people who wrote them. The gap between the public founding narrative and the private record of what was actually planned and discussed is significant. The silo was built with more than one exit. The general population is aware of one. The radar deployment systems used to send teams to the surface. But architectural details and references in maintenance logs suggest the existence of at least 2 additional egress points that are not publicly acknowledged. Where those exits lead and who has access to them is not answered directly in the law, but their existence implies a contingency planning process that went well beyond the official narrative of everyone being in this together. The energy systems that power the silo are described at a general level in the accessible technical documents. What those general descriptions omit is any detail about the primary power source. The backup systems are described in some detail. The redundancies are explained, but the main power generation method is referenced only obliquely as a primary deep system that requires specialist maintenance. The specialists who maintain it are listed in the personnel records as a separate technical division with its own access protocols and, based on one partially corrupted record, its own separate living quarters. The silo's relationship to the surface is officially framed as one of cautious necessity. Raiders go up because survival requires it, and they return with what the community needs. But the structure of the Raider program, the way it is funded, administered, and how its returns are allocated, suggests the program serves purposes beyond basic resource acquisition. There is a category of recovered material that goes directly to the administrative level and is never logged in the general supply record. What falls into that category and why it is separately managed is one of the silo's more carefully guarded operational secrets. The history of the silo, as taught to its residents, has gone through at least 4 major revisions since the founding. Each revision can be partially reconstructed from the discrepancies between records from different periods that survive in the game's databases. The trend across those revisions is consistent. The role of individual founders is diminished in each successive version, institutional authority is elevated, and the messiness of the early decision-making period is smoothed over into a cleaner, more unified founding narrative. The silo's history has been edited to serve the silo's present. There are rooms in the silo that do not appear on any publicly accessible map. This is not speculation. The game's environmental storytelling shows corridors that lead to unmarked spaces, maintenance access points that connect to areas not documented in the official layout, and gaps in the publicly accessible floor plans that suggest significant omitted spaces. The silo is larger than its residents know, and what occupies the unlisted space is something the lore builds toward without fully revealing. The water recycling systems in the silo are a genuine engineering achievement and are rightly credited in the official documents. What is less prominently featured in those same documents is the fact that the recycling capacity significantly exceeds the documented population's needs. Overcapacity in a critical system is good engineering practice, but the margin of overcapacity in the silo's water system is large enough to suggest planning for a population significantly larger than the one officially acknowledged. Either the silo was built for more people than it houses, or it was built knowing that at some point it might need to house more. The security force in the silo is described in the official documents as a community safety organization focused on internal order and the management of raider deployments. The size of that force cross-referenced against the documented population is larger than internal order, and raider management would typically require. The training protocols referenced in some of the accessible records go beyond what a community safety function would need. There is a military structure underneath the civilian framing of the silo security apparatus, and the question of what it is ultimately organized to do is left sitting quietly in the background of the law. The silo has experienced at least 3 internal crises that do not appear in the official history accessible to residents. These can be reconstructed from damaged records, maintenance logs from specific periods, and medical data that, while it has gaps, reveals a pattern of elevated treatment for stress-related and trauma-related conditions in specific time windows. Something happened more than once, something serious enough to leave traces in multiple record systems, but not serious enough, or perhaps too serious, to be incorporated into the official narrative of the silo's history. The psychological effect of living in the silo is something the game captures in its ambient details and NPC dialogue in ways that official records don't acknowledge directly. People have adapted, they have built lives and found meaning, and the community functions. But underneath the functional surface, in the offhand comments and the details of how people talk about the surface and the future, there is a resignation that goes deeper than situational. People in the silo have largely stopped believing the surface will be reclaimed in their lifetime. The question is whether that belief was allowed to die naturally or was quietly encouraged to do so. The silo's true purpose, or at least one version of what that purpose might be, is suggested in a fragmented document that players can find in an obscure location. The document appears to be an early planning record, and it describes the silo not as a refuge, but as a seed vault, a term used not for plant genetics, but for something described as continuity of essential function. What essential function is never named in the surviving portion of the document, but the framing suggests that whatever the silo was originally designed to preserve, it may not primarily be the people living in it. The founding generation of the silo is aging, and the game's lore touches on this with a quietness that is itself telling. The decisions made by that founding generation shaped every aspect of silo life, and those decisions were made in a context that no one currently alive in the silo fully understands. As the people who made those decisions age out of active roles, the institutional knowledge of why things are the way they are is eroding. What the silo will become when the last of the founders are gone, and whether the systems they built will maintain their coherence without the people who understood their original purpose, is a question the lore leaves very deliberately unresolved. The raids are the one part of silo life where residents get unmediated contact with the reality of the outside world, and the administration's relationship with that contact is complicated. Raiders see things that complicate the official narrative. They bring back information along with materials. The system for debriefing raiders and processing what they report is extensive, and the portions of that process that are not visible to the raider being debriefed are, based on what the lore suggests, significant. What happens to the information that raiders bring back, and which parts of it reach the general population in any form, is another of the quiet mechanisms by which the silo manages what its residents understand about their situation. The silo is not the only structure of its kind. The lore suggests this carefully and without confirmation through references to parallel programs in some documents and through raider accounts of finding structures on the surface that appear to have been built with the same design logic as certain silo sections. Whether those structures are related silo projects, rival projects, or something else entirely is never confirmed. But the implication that the silo exists within a larger architecture of planned human survival adds a dimension to its story that the official account never acknowledges. What the silo really is, when you step back from the official narrative and look at all of these details together, is something that defies simple categorization. It is a refuge, genuinely, imperfectly, and with real human cost. It is also an experiment, a managed population in a controlled environment with specific outcomes being steered toward by people who have more information than those they govern. It is a vault, preserving something. It is a military installation maintaining capabilities it has not disclosed. And it is a story being told to itself, revised as needed, with the earlier drafts carefully filed away, where they are unlikely to be found. All of those things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is what makes the silo one of the most interesting spaces in the game's world. Chapter 3. The First Raiders. The first people who went to the surface after the silo was sealed were not officially sanctioned. This is one of those details that the official history has quietly edited out, but the traces of it remain in the early maintenance logs and in the accounts of the oldest silo residents, told in fragments and with the particular carefulness of people who have learned that certain memories are safer kept private. The first surface expeditions were unauthorized, improvised, and driven by a combination of desperation and a refusal to accept the finality of being sealed underground. Those early unauthorized excursions were not equipped the way modern raiders are equipped. The people who went up in the first months after sealing used whatever they could adapt from available materials. The gear was dangerous, the exposure protocols were improvised, and the mortality rate, as far as it can be reconstructed from the scattered records, was extremely high. The people who came back from those early trips were changed, not just by what they saw, but by the act of going at all, of asserting that the surface was still accessible, still part of a world they belonged to. The official Raider program came later, built on the foundation of what those early unauthorized expeditions proved was possible. The founding council did not acknowledge the unauthorized expeditions publicly. Instead, they created a program, gave it structure and oversight and protocol, and presented it as a deliberate and carefully considered response to the community's resource needs. The history of how raiding began was absorbed into the official narrative in a form that served institutional authority rather than individual truth. The first officially sanctioned raiders were selected through a process that the records describe as voluntary, but that the broader context of early silo life suggests was less than entirely free. Resources in the silo were tightly constrained in the early period. The people most likely to volunteer for dangerous surface work were those with the least to lose or the most to gain within the silo's emerging social structure. The first Raider Corps was drawn heavily from the parts of the population that the founding administration found easiest to motivate toward risk. The equipment issued to the first official raiders was better than what the unauthorized pioneers had used, but not by as much as the official record implies. There were shortcuts in the early gear that the people issuing it were aware of, and that the people wearing it were not fully informed about. This is documented in a maintenance record that was clearly intended for internal administrative use and not for general access. The calculated risk was deemed acceptable by people who were not taking it themselves. The first raider teams were given objectives rather than the more flexible scavenging mandates that characterized the raider program in the game's present. Those objectives were specific: particular locations, particular categories of material, particular types of equipment. The specificity of those early objectives is significant because it implies that whoever was directing them knew exactly what was out there and where to find it. That level of knowledge, in the earliest period after sealing, suggests pre-existing intelligence about the surface that was not shared with the raider teams themselves. The attrition rate of the first raider cohort is not documented in the publicly accessible records. It is reconstructed from absences in the personnel database and from medical records for the period, which show a specific pattern of losses concentrated in the first 18 months of the official program. Based on those reconstructed numbers, the survival rate of the founding raider generation was dramatically lower than the survival rate of later cohorts, and the gap is too large to be explained entirely by improving equipment and protocols. The culture that grew up around raiding developed partly in response to that high early mortality. The rituals, the language, the specific kind of dark humour that raiders use in the game's ambient dialogue, all of these developed in a context where people were dying at a rate that couldn't be publicly acknowledged without creating a political crisis. The raider culture became a way of managing that reality internally, among the people who knew it, without allowing it to filter outward in a form that would disrupt the silo's functioning. Among the first raider cohort, there were people who survived long enough to become something different from what they had started as. Repeated surface exposure changed them, not in the dramatic ways that pre-fall fiction imagined exposure to technological catastrophe would change people, but in subtler ways. Their relationship to the silo shifted. Their relationship to the surface shifted. They came to occupy a psychological and social space that did not fit comfortably inside the silo's official categories, and the administration's response to that discomfort is recorded in ways that are not flattering to the administration. The raider who is credited in the official record with the first significant successful extraction is a figure whose actual history is considerably more complicated than the official account suggests. The narrative that was built around this person, the heroic pioneer who proved the program could work, was constructed for its utility to the administration's goals rather than for its accuracy. The real circumstances of that first extraction, as suggested by the fragmented alternative records, were messier, more ambiguous, and involved decisions that would have been politically difficult to acknowledge publicly. The first raiders who developed what might be called a philosophical relationship to the surface, who began to think about what it meant to move through those ruins, and what the ruins said about the world that had been lost, were regarded with something between admiration and suspicion by the silo administration. On one hand, these were people who were good at their jobs and who helped develop the knowledge base and training methodology that would sustain the program. On the other hand, they were developing thoughts and perspectives that the administration could not entirely control or predict. The accounts of the first surface environments that raiders documented describe a world in a state that the game captures in its environmental design. The cities were intact enough to be recognizable, but wrong in ways that went beyond physical damage. The Ark machines had not simply destroyed things. They had reorganized them in ways that suggested purpose, even if that purpose was not one that human observers could read clearly. The first raiders were not just surviving a dangerous environment, they were moving through the evidence of something they did not understand. The relationship between the first raiders and the first generation of silo children is touched on in several of the game's documents in ways that are quietly affecting. The children who grew up hearing raider accounts developed a relationship to the surface that was shaped entirely by those accounts. The surface they imagined was built from the filtered, edited, carefully shaped stories that raiders were permitted to share publicly, which was not always the same as what the raiders had actually seen and felt. The gap between the experienced surface and the imagined surface is a distance that the game measures through its storytelling without ever explicitly naming it. The first raider who refused to go back up is mentioned in one of the game's more obscure terminal entries, briefly and without much detail. What is given is enough to suggest that this person's refusal was not cowardice, but something more principled, a refusal based on what they had seen and what they had been asked to do with that information. The entry notes that this individual was subsequently reassigned within the silo. What that reassignment entailed and whether the person was accommodated or suppressed is left as an open question that the law does not close. The training methodology that the first successful raiders developed was not entirely formal. Much of it was passed person to person in the specific practical language of people who had learned things the hard way. The official training program that eventually formalized raider preparation drew heavily on this informal knowledge while simultaneously trying to standardize it in ways that stripped out some of its most important nuances. Raiders who trained under the old informal system and those who trained under the formal program could tell the difference in the field, and the tension between those two knowledge traditions is present in the game's world as a background texture. The equipment left behind by the first raider cohort, in caches and in ruins, and in places that only certain veteran raiders know about, is a category of artifact that carries a specific weight in the lore. These are not just old tools, they are material evidence of what the first people to go up knew and did not know, what they prepared for, and what they encountered that they had not prepared for. A raider who finds a piece of first-generation equipment finds a piece of history that the official record has not entirely captured. The rivalries and alliances that formed within the first raider cohort shaped the political landscape of the silo in ways that echo into the game's present. The founding generation of raiders was a small group under extreme pressure, and the dynamics that developed among them, the loyalty networks, and the grudges, and the informal hierarchies became the template for raider social organization in the decades that followed. To understand how raiders relate to each other and to the silo administration in the game's present, it helps to understand what happened in those first few years when the whole program was being built under conditions that could not be fully acknowledged. The first raider to die on the surface in the official program is memorialized in the silo in a way that is, on close examination, significantly less prominent than the memorialization of the first officially credited successful extraction. This disparity is not accidental. The founding administration made choices about what stories to tell and how prominently to tell them, and a story about loss was less useful to institutional goals than a story about success. The person who died is remembered, but in a quiet corner, in a form that does not invite the questions their death might have prompted. The surface landscape encountered by the first raiders was still hot in some ways that the official account sanitized. Not radioactively hot, the Ark incursion was not nuclear in that simple sense, but environmentally destabilized in ways that created conditions the first raiders were not fully briefed on. Some of the physical effects that first cohort members experienced, effects that appear in fragments of the medical record, were attributed in official channels to causes other than surface exposure. The actual record of what surface exposure did to the first raiders' bodies is not easily accessible within the game world. The first raiders who came back with Ark components were the beginning of a practice that became central to the survival of the silo, and that also introduced a dynamic that the founding administration had not fully anticipated. Ark technology was valuable. The people who retrieved it acquired a form of leverage that did not fit neatly into the silo's intended social structure. The administration's response to that leverage, the mechanisms it developed to manage and control the flow of Ark-derived technology, is one of the less visible but more consequential developments in the silo's early history. The first raider, who appears to have actively studied Ark behavior rather than simply evading it, is referenced in the game's lore as a turning point in how the program developed its operational doctrine. This person, whose identity is suggested but not confirmed in the available records, developed observational methodologies that became the foundation of what the silo eventually formalized as Ark behavioral analysis. The knowledge that raiders carry today about how Ark units move and respond traces back through several generations of transmission and formalization to what one person figured out by watching very carefully and writing it down. The stories that the first raiders told when they returned, the ones that were not in their official reports, were told in private to people they trusted. Some of those private accounts were written down, and a small number of those written accounts survived in personal effects or hidden caches that eventually found their way back into the silo. The game's found document collection includes some of these private accounts, and they read differently from the official reports, more confused, more frightened, more uncertain, and more honestly grappling with what the surface actually was and what it meant that it had become what it had become. The culture of the first raiders and the culture of current raiders share recognizable elements, but are not the same thing. The experience of the first generation, the formative combination of grief, danger, discovery, and institutional pressure, produced a specific kind of person with a specific relationship to the world. That experience cannot be transmitted through training or tradition. It can only be approximated, and what the current raider culture approximates is a version of the founding experience that has been shaped by everything that happened between then and now, including the parts of the history that have been officially forgotten. The first raiders are now a myth within the silo, which is what happens to foundational figures in any community that has had enough time to build a collective memory. The myth serves a purpose, the purpose of inspiring current raiders and giving the program a heroic origin story. But myths simplify, and what they simplify in this case is the ambivalence and the suffering and the moral complexity of what the first raider generation actually lived through. They were not heroes in the clean sense the myth requires. They were people in an impossible situation doing the best they could, and what that actually looked like is one of the things that the silo's official history has worked hardest to smooth over. Chapter 4. The truth about the surface. The surface that raiders move through today is not the surface that the first expeditions documented. It has changed, and the nature of that change is one of the more disquieting elements of the game's world because it does not match what you would expect from simple physical degradation over time. Things have shifted in ways that suggest ongoing activity, intentional reorganization, the continued operation of systems that have been running uninterrupted since before anyone went underground. The surface is not a frozen ruin, it is a live environment, actively managed by something that does not sleep. The atmosphere above the silo's location is described in the game's accessible documents as monitored through a system of sensors that provide readings to the administrative level. Those readings are summarized in reports that are accessible to the general population. The raw sensor data is not accessible. The gap between raw data and summary report is a consistent feature of how the silo manages information, and it is as present in the atmospheric readings as it is everywhere else. What the sensors actually measure and what the summaries choose to report may not be perfectly aligned. The visual appearance of the surface in the game, the specific quality of the light, and the way the sky looks in different conditions contains details that players with a background in meteorology or atmospheric physics have flagged as unusual. The cloud formations described in some raider accounts and visible in the game's world do not correspond to natural meteorological processes in ways that suggest normal post-catastrophe environmental disruption. They correspond to something more systematic, which points toward either ongoing arc activity affecting the upper atmosphere or something larger that the lore has not yet addressed directly. The flora that has returned to some areas of the surface is documented in raider accounts and in the game's environmental design, and it is not the flora you would expect from a simple ecological recovery. The species that have come back and the patterns in which they have come back suggest that something is influencing the recovery process in ways that natural succession would not produce. Whether this influence is accidental, a byproduct of arc activity, or something more deliberate is another open question that the lore keeps alive without resolving. The ruins of pre-fall structures are preserved in varying states across the surface, and the variation in preservation is not random. Buildings that appear to have held certain kinds of equipment or housed certain kinds of activity are more intact than would be expected given their exposure. Buildings that appear to have been purely residential or administrative are often in much worse condition. The selective preservation suggests that whatever the arcs were cataloguing or protecting in the early days of the incursion, they were not doing it uniformly. Some things were more important to preserve than others. The temperature differentials across the surface are more extreme than the game's general description of the surface environment would suggest. Specific zones, particularly around certain arc installation sites and around the remains of certain pre-fall industrial structures, register temperatures that are anomalous relative to the surrounding environment. Raiders who have documented these anomalies in the games found records note them as navigational references, useful for orientation without necessarily having a framework for explaining what causes them. The causes, based on the law's larger context, are likely significant. The sound environment on the surface is something that radar accounts return to with a consistency that suggests it has a specific psychological impact. The silo is a managed acoustic environment, controlled and relatively predictable. The surface is not. It has its own acoustic character, shaped by arc machinery, by wind moving through structures in specific ways, by sounds that radars cannot identify and do not always report officially because some of them are difficult to describe in terms that feel credible. The acoustic landscape of the surface is part of what makes it disorienting, and part of what makes some radars feel that it is telling them something they do not have the vocabulary to understand. The chemical composition of the surface air is described in the official documents as hazardous and requiring the use of protection equipment. What the official documents are less specific about is the way that composition varies by zone and over time. Radars who have been to the same location on multiple occasions describe measurable changes in air quality between visits, changes that don't correspond to simple atmospheric variation. The surface air is not just hazardous, it appears to be actively changing, and the direction of those changes, based on what data exists, is not reassuring. The presence of water on the surface in the specific forms and locations where it appears is one of the details that players investigating the law have found most suggestive. Water has collected in places where it should not have collected, given the architecture and geography. It is absent in places where it should naturally pool. The pattern of surface water distribution suggests that it is being managed, channeled somewhere or away from somewhere, in ways that imply active infrastructure operating underneath or alongside the visible ruins. The ground itself on the surface has properties that radars describe in terms that are hard to square with standard geological processes. In certain zones, the ground transmits vibration in ways that suggest large-scale mechanical activity at depth. In other zones, the composition of the surface layer has changed in ways that excavation reveals to be several meters deep, which is more than surface disturbance would produce. The surface is not just the top of the Earth's crust exposed to the elements. Something has been happening underneath it, and what that something is connects to the larger questions about what the arcs have been doing with the time they have had. The mapping of the surface is an ongoing project within the radar program, and the accumulated maps, when overlaid, reveal a pattern of change that is one of the more striking pieces of evidence for sustained arc activity. Structures present in early raids that are absent in later ones. Open areas that have been partially enclosed by arc construction. Routes that have been blocked, apparently deliberately, in ways that redirect radar movement along certain corridors. The surface is being shaped, and the shape it is being moved toward is not yet clear. The light behavior in certain surface zones is described by radars as wrong in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely. Shadows fall in incorrect directions at certain times of day. Reflections from arc surfaces have qualities that suggest the materials involved interact with light in ways that go beyond simple reflectivity. Some of this can be explained by the particular properties of arc alloys and surfaces. Some of it points toward phenomena that are less easily categorized within a conventional physical framework. The electromagnetic environment on the surface affects radar equipment in ways that have been partially documented and partially remain mysterious. The interference patterns that certain zones produce are not random noise. They have structure, they repeat, they intensify and diminish on schedules that, once recognized, can be used as timing information. What those schedules correspond to, what cycle or process produces them, is something that radar knowledge includes empirically without always including theoretically. The surface zones that radars call dead zones, areas of anomalously low arc activity, are not randomly distributed. Their positions, when plotted, suggest they are defined by something underneath the surface, rather than anything visible above it. Raiders who have spent extended time in dead zones report them as quieter in a way that goes beyond the simple absence of Ark machinery noise. They are quiet in a way that feels intentional, curated, like a space that has been specifically made to be empty of something. The implication is that the dead zones are not places the Arks have neglected, but places they have deliberately cleared. The animal life that persists on the surface exists in a distribution that makes more sense as a managed population than as a natural remnant. Certain species are present in numbers that should not be sustainable in the current surface environment. Others that would be expected to persist based on their pre-fall distribution are absent. The ecology of the surface has been shaped by something, and the shaping hand, based on the pattern, appears to be the same hand that shaped everything else up there. There are locations on the surface that raiders avoid, not because of documented Ark presence or environmental hazard, but because of something less definable. The game's found documents occasionally reference these locations in terms that stop short of direct acknowledgement of what makes them avoided. They are described as uncomfortable, as places where equipment behaves unreliably, as areas where raiders make decisions to leave without being entirely clear on what motivated the decision. Whether these responses are rational responses to something real or are products of the psychological pressure of surface work is a question the law declines to resolve. The ruins of communications infrastructure on the surface are particularly interesting to look at closely because some of them appear to have been repurposed rather than simply destroyed or left in place. Ark units have integrated certain pre-fall communication structures into configurations that suggest they are still functionally operational, at least at a basic level. What those repurposed structures are transmitting or receiving, and to or from where, connects to the larger question of the Ark communication network that is one of the game's central unresolved mysteries. The seasonal variation on the surface is documented, but not in the way that normal seasonal cycles would produce. The changes visible between different season raider accounts are consistent in their basic form, but anomalous in their timing and intensity. The surface has weather, but the weather has been modified by years of Ark activity and the environmental changes that have followed from it. What the surface's climate looked like before the Arks and what it looks like now are substantially different, and the direction of the change towards something more regular, more predictable, more like the weather of a managed environment rather than a natural one, is telling. The architecture that the Arks have constructed or modified on the surface is not aesthetically neutral. It has a character, a recurring set of proportions and spatial relationships that repeats across different Ark structures in different locations. This consistency suggests a design language rather than purely functional construction. Design language implies something like aesthetics, and aesthetics imply an evaluating perspective, a sense of how things should look. The idea that the Arks have something analogous to aesthetic preferences is unsettling in ways that the game's lore appears fully aware of. The truth about the surface is ultimately that it is not the dead world that the silo's official narrative describes. It is an active world, being worked on and shaped and transformed by something that has been operating up there continuously since before anyone went underground. The transformation is slow relative to a human lifetime, which is maybe why it is possible for the official narrative to maintain the fiction of a static ruin. But if you look at the surface data across decades rather than expeditions, what you see is movement, direction, purpose. The surface is going somewhere, being made into something, and the destination and who or what decided on it is the deepest truth about what is happening up there. Chapter 5. The Council's Hidden Agenda. The founding council of the silo is documented in the official record as a group of emergency managers, technical experts, and community leaders who came together in a crisis to make the decisions necessary for survival. That description is accurate as far as it goes. What it omits is the infrastructure of prior relationship and prior planning that connected those individuals before the crisis, and that shaped the decisions they made during it. The council did not form in a crisis. The crisis activated a structure that was already in place. The composition of the founding council reflects specific institutional affiliations that are not random. The technical and scientific expertise represented maps onto a particular pre-fall research and development context that the official history of the silo never fully describes. The members brought specific knowledge with them, knowledge that determined what the silo could do and how it was structured, and that knowledge had an origin that is not fully accounted for in the public record. The Council's early meeting records, in the portions that are accessible within the game, are notable for what they do not discuss. There are no records of debates about fundamental questions that any newly formed community would need to address. The basis of authority, the rights of individuals, the mechanisms for challenging decisions. These questions were apparently settled before the records begin, or they were settled in sessions that did not produce accessible records. Either possibility is informative about how the Council understood its own authority. The agenda items that do appear in the early Council records are highly operational: resource allocation, security protocols, radar program development, medical system design, all legitimate and important, but the absence of political and philosophical discussion in the available record in a community that was literally creating its own society from scratch suggests that certain foundational questions were not open for discussion. They had been pre-answered, and the Council's role was implementation rather than deliberation. The relationship between the founding council and the pre-fall governmental structures it nominally replaced is described in the official documents as one of continuity. The council stepped in to maintain essential functions when existing governance failed. What the documents are less clear about is whether the council was accountable to the population it governed in any meaningful way. The mechanisms of accountability that existed in the pre-fall world are absent from the founding documents, and the official explanation for their absence, emergency conditions requiring unified decision-making, is exactly the kind of explanation that is never revisited when the emergency becomes the permanent state. There are individuals named in the founding council records who do not appear in any earlier accessible document, public or internal. This is unusual enough to be notable. The official explanation might be that they were from contexts where records simply did not survive, which is plausible given the chaos of the fall period. But the consistency with which these undocumented individuals appear in the most sensitive areas of council activity suggests another possibility. They were not previously undocumented, but previously classified, operating in roles that were not publicly recorded, because public recording was not appropriate for what they did. The council's early decisions about radar program structure are revealing when looked at from the angle of what they chose not to control directly. The radar program was set up with operational autonomy in certain areas, specifically the areas dealing with what was found on the surface and how it was categorized. That autonomy looks, from one angle, like practical delegation to the people with relevant expertise. From another angle, it looks like a structural separation between what the administration officially knew and what was actually being recovered and done with, providing plausible deniability on matters the council had specific reasons not to be officially informed about. The succession mechanism for the council, how new members were selected, and how authority was transferred, is described in the founding documents in terms that are more aspirational than operational. In practice, the succession mechanism that actually operated was less transparent than the founding documents imply. The pattern of who joined the council and under what circumstances, reconstructed from membership records across several generations of council composition, suggests a selection process oriented toward ideological alignment with founding priorities rather than community representation or expertise diversity. The Council's relationship to the scientific and technical community within the silo is complex. On one hand, the Council's authority is grounded partly in technical legitimacy. They have access to expertise that the general population does not, and that expertise is real and valuable. On the other hand, the Council controls what research is permitted and how results are classified, which gives them the ability to shape what the technical community knows and what it is able to ask. The scientists who work in areas sensitive to the Council's agenda operate within boundaries they may not always be consciously aware of. The Council maintains a category of decision-making that has no formal name in the accessible documents, but that is referenced obliquely in multiple places as the deeper operational level. Decisions at this level are not recorded in accessible minutes, are not subject to review by other Council members below a certain access threshold, and appear to relate primarily to the things that connect the silos present to whatever the silo was originally designed to accomplish. The existence of this decision-making category is one of the clearest indicators that the Council's public-facing governance function is not the whole of what the Council does. The hidden agenda, to the extent that it can be reconstructed from available law, appears to centre on a goal that goes beyond the maintenance of the silo as a survival community. The Council appears to be managing toward a specific outcome, an event or achievement that the founding documents described, but that subsequent revisions have removed from the publicly accessible record. What that outcome is and what the timeline for it might be is one of the central mysteries of Arkwraider's law, and one of the things that makes the Council's secrecy feel less like ordinary political self-interest and more like the management of a very long-term plan. The Council's relationship to ARC technology is managed through protocols that are unusually compartmentalized, even by silo standards. Certain categories of recovered ARC technology never appear in the general supply record. The specialists who work with those categories are a separate group with separate housing and access protocols, as previously noted. The Council members who oversee that work are those at the highest access threshold. This structure around a specific category of recovered material suggests that the Council's interest in the ARCs goes well beyond what is needed for community survival and defence. The communications that pass between Council members at the higher access levels and the surface, through channels not available to the general Raider communication system, are referenced in one corrupted document in a way that suggests they are not just passive monitoring of Raider activity. There appear to be two-way communications, instructions going out, and reports coming in relating to surface activities that are not part of the official Raider program. What those activities are, and what the Council is trying to accomplish through them, adds a dimension to the Raider program that the game's surface exploration may only partially capture. The relationship between the Council's hidden agenda and the ARC behaviour is the place where the most significant questions accumulate. It is possible that the Council has information about the ARCs, about what they are and what they want, that would materially change how the silo situation is understood by its inhabitants. If such information exists and is being withheld, the question of why is not easily answered by simple self-interest. The potential reasons for withholding that information, if it is what the law suggests it might be, go deeper than political calculation and into territory that would require the silo's founding story to be fundamentally revised. The hidden agenda of the Council is, in the end, a nested mystery. On the outer layer is the question of what the Council is not telling the silo's general population. On the inner layer is the question of what the Council knows. And at the centre is the question of whether the Council fully understands the situation it is managing, or whether the people in charge of the most important secrets in the silo are themselves only partially informed, operating on a partial understanding of a plan whose full dimensions may be beyond anyone currently alive to reconstruct. Chapter 6. The Machine Language. The ARCs communicate. This is not a hypothesis. There is enough evidence in the game's environmental design and found documents to treat it as an established fact of the world. What remains mysterious is the nature and content of that communication, and what, if anything, it would mean for humans to understand it. The machine language of the Arks is one of the most heavily researched topics within the small community of Silo scholars who have been permitted to work on it, and the results of that research are among the most carefully controlled pieces of information in the Silo. The sounds that Ark units produce during their normal operations have been analysed by researchers within the Silo, and the analysis has consistently shown patterns that go beyond what functional mechanical operation would require. The sounds have rhythmic structure. They have variation that corresponds to environmental changes and to the presence and behaviour of other Ark units in the area. They modulate in ways that suggest they are carrying information rather than simply being byproducts of mechanical function. The visual signals that Ark units produce, the light patterns and displays on their surfaces, follow a similar logic. There are consistent patterns that repeat across unit types and across geographic zones, which suggests they belong to a shared communicative system rather than being unit-specific outputs. The inventory of documented visual patterns maintained by Silo researchers has grown substantially over the decades of the Raider program, and the growing inventory has not made interpretation easier. The more patterns that are documented, the more complex the apparent structure of the language becomes. The early attempts to decode Ark communication were based on the assumption that any sufficiently complex communicative system would have analogues to human linguistic structure, something like words, something like grammar, something like reference to environmental objects. Those attempts produced partial results, enough to identify that the system has structure, but the structure does not map cleanly onto human linguistic categories. The analogy that some researchers have found more useful is music theory rather than linguistics, a system organized around relationships and ratios rather than discrete semantic units. The inter-unit communication that happens between Ark machines in proximity is particularly dense and rapid. When multiple Ark units are operating in the same zone, the exchange of signals between them is continuous and the information density appears to be extremely high. Raider accounts of observing Ark units in groups consistently note that the machines seem to be in a constant state of negotiation or coordination, updating each other's apparent operational parameters in real time based on some stream of shared input that human observers cannot directly access. There are locations on the surface that appear to function as communication nodes, places where Ark signal activity is concentrated in ways that suggest they serve as relay or amplification points in a larger network. These nodes appear to have been present from the early days of the Ark incursion. Some of them coincide with repurposed pre-fall infrastructure, as previously noted, and others appear to have been constructed from scratch by Ark units using locally available materials. The existence of this physical communication infrastructure implies a level of network planning that was present from the beginning of the Ark presence. The range over which Ark units appear to be able to communicate is a subject of active debate within the Silo's research community, to the extent that that community exists and is permitted to debate anything. The documented range exceeds what the known signal output of individual Ark units should be able to support, which suggests either a relay network of the type just described or a communication mechanism that does not rely on the electromagnetic signals that are the most easily measurable. Either possibility has significant implications for understanding what the Arks know about each other's situation at any given time. The possibility that Ark communication includes something analogous to memory, stored and transmitted records of previous states and events, is raised in one of the more speculative of the Silo's accessible research documents. If Ark units can transmit not just present state information, but historical records, then the Ark communication network might function as a kind of distributed memory, with any unit potentially able to access the accumulated experience of many units across a wide area and a long time span. This would explain certain ARC behavioral patterns that otherwise look like distributed learning at a rate faster than individual experience would produce. The language appears to have changed over time. Comparing early documented patterns with more recent recordings shows shifts that are consistent across the geographic range of the documented sample, which means the changes are system-wide rather than local. A communicative system that changes consistently across a distributed network implies a form of coordination that updates the system itself, not just the content being communicated. The ARCs are not just talking to each other. They appear to be, in some sense, talking about how to talk. The question of what the ARC language might be saying, even in the most general terms, is where the research becomes most cautious and most controlled. The Silos research community has produced working hypotheses, but those hypotheses are at the highest access restriction level within the system, which means the general population and most raiders have no direct access to what the researchers believe they are beginning to understand. The fact that the results are restricted at the highest level is itself informative. Whatever the working hypotheses say, they are apparently significant enough that the Council has decided the general population should not have access to them. Chapter 7. What the ARCs are searching for. The behaviour of ARC units in areas where they have not previously operated is consistent enough to be recognised as a search pattern. They do not move randomly. They grid an area methodically, they respond to certain kinds of material or signal, and they prioritise the investigation of specific locations over others in ways that reflect criteria that are not fully understood by the humans observing them. The ARCs are looking for something, and the question of what that something is may be the most important question in the game's world. The material categories that reliably attract ARC attention are only partially documented in the accessible research records. Certain types of alloy, certain energy signatures, certain kinds of structural configuration. These are known to draw ARC investigation in ways that other materials and configurations do not. But the list of known attractors is not complete. Raiders report ARC responses to things that don't match the documented categories, which suggests either that the list is still being built or that the attractors include something that the research community has not been able to identify or has identified and classified. The depth of ARC search behaviour in areas of confirmed interest is notable. When ARC units identify something of interest, the investigation is thorough in a way that goes well beyond surface examination. They excavate, they disassemble, they appear to analyse at levels of detail that their visible instrumentation should not be able to support. The implication is that ARC units have investigative capabilities that are not externally visible, sensing or processing mechanisms that operate below the level of what human observers can directly observe. The geographic distribution of zones where ARC search behaviour is most intensive is not uniform. There are concentrations, areas where multiple ARC units converge and operate at elevated investigative intensity. These concentrations do not correspond neatly to any obvious geographic or geological feature, which suggests the criteria the ARCs are using to prioritise locations are not based on surface-level geography. They appear to be based on something that the ARCs can detect and that human instruments, at least the instruments available to the radar program, cannot. The relationship between ARC search behaviour and ARC construction is worth examining. In zones where intensive search behaviour has been documented over extended periods, a pattern emerges. The search eventually leads to construction. Something is found, or the absence of something is confirmed, and the ARC response shifts from investigation to building. What they build in those zones and the relationship between the searched for thing and what gets built is a chain of causation the law presents without fully closing. There is evidence in the game's world that the ARCs have been systematically searching the subterranean environment as well as the surface. The vibrations at depth that radars have documented in certain zones, and the arc activity near known geological features point toward an investigative interest that extends underground. If the arcs are searching below the surface, then the silo's underground location is not automatically protective in the way that the founding logic assumed. The question of whether the arcs know the silo is there is one that the official documents don't address directly. The rate of arc search coverage, based on the observed movement patterns of arc units over the documented history of the radar program, suggests that they are working through a specific area systematically, and that the systematic search has a direction. The coverage is moving in a consistent direction, slowly but measurably, and the trajectory of that movement, extended forward, points toward a region that the silo's maps identify as a priority research zone. The convergence of arc search behavior and silo research interest in the same geographic region is either a significant coincidence or evidence that they are both looking for the same thing. The items that radars have recovered that appear to have been previously investigated by arc units carry distinctive marks of arc examination. The way those marks are distributed across different object types and materials reveals a consistent priority ordering. Some things are examined more thoroughly than others. Some are discarded quickly. Some are apparently taken rather than simply analysed and left. The priority ordering of the arc examination process is a map of what they consider important, and reading that map carefully is one of the more productive ways of approaching the question of what they're searching for. The null result, locations where arc search behaviour has been intense but where nothing appears to have been found, is as informative as the positive results. When arc units exhaust a zone of interest and move on, the pattern of what they leave behind tells you something about what they were looking for. The zones that have been intensively searched and then apparently abandoned have a specific character. They are not damaged randomly, but in ways that suggest a specific type of structural analysis was being performed. Whatever the arcs were looking for in those zones, they were looking for it in a consistent place, a consistent depth, a consistent structural context. The possibility that what the arcs are searching for is related to what was in the pre-fall industrial zone where the first serious arc incursion occurred is one of the threads that the law keeps visible without pulling on directly. That first zone, whatever was there, attracted the first intensive arc attention. The search behaviour documented in subsequent years follows a spatial logic that would be consistent with a search that started there and has been expanding outward ever since. Whether the arcs found what they were looking for in the first zone, and whether the subsequent search is for more of the same thing, or for something that the first zone revealed the existence of, are questions that the game's lore keeps alive with careful precision. Chapter 8. The Lost Colonies. The game's world contains references to communities that were not incorporated into the silo structure, groups that either could not reach the silo in time or chose not to. The official history of the silo treats these groups as casualties of the fall, people who did not survive the transition to the new world. But scattered through the lore are hints that the story of these lost communities is more complicated than the official history acknowledges, and that some of them may not be entirely lost. The first references to what might be called lost colonies appear in early radar reports that documented encountering signs of human habitation in zones that should have been uninhabited according to the official account. These signs were initially explained as remnants of pre-fall occupation that raiders were misidentifying, but the pattern of discoveries, the freshness of certain materials, the specific types of improvised modifications to structures, and the arrangement of found objects suggests, in at least some cases, that people had been there recently rather than decades ago. The decision not to investigate those early signs of potential habitation more thoroughly is recorded in council minutes as a resource allocation decision. The radar program was not in a position to devote missions to uncertain social exploration when material needs were pressing. This is a plausible explanation. It is also consistent with the decision to avoid confirming the existence of independent communities that would complicate the silo's self-description as the sole repository of organised human survival. Some of the lost colony candidates are associated with specific geographic features that would have made longer-term independent survival more plausible than in the open surface environment. Deep natural cave systems, pre-fall underground facilities not associated with the silo program, heavily fortified pre-fall structures in zones of lower arc activity. The game's world contains examples of all of these categories, and the evidence of periodic human presence in several of them is documented in raider accounts across multiple decades. The question of what happened to the people who did not make it to the silo is sometimes framed in the game's found documents as a moral one, a question of responsibility and guilt that the silo's founding generation apparently grappled with in private while managing a public narrative of having done everything possible. The private grappling is visible in personal documents, in the notes of silo physicians who treated founding generation members for conditions consistent with moral injury, and in the spiritual and philosophical writings that some of those individuals left behind. The public management left a cleaner record. There are maps in some of the game's less accessible locations that appear to mark locations beyond the known raider operational range. Some of those locations are annotated with symbols that the main cartographic system does not use, and that appear to be a secondary notation system developed for specific purposes. The locations marked with secondary notation cluster in areas that the primary documentation identifies as having shown signs of non-arc human activity. What the secondary notation means and who developed it is not explained in any accessible record. The potential relationship between any surviving lost colonies and the current situation in the silo is something the lore treats as a background possibility rather than a developed thread. But it is present, and it points toward a future narrative possibility, that the silo is not the only centre of human survival, and that the implications of that for how the silo's administration has characterised its own authority are significant. A community that believes itself to be the last organised remnant of humanity makes different decisions than a community that knows it is one of several. The lost colony thread in the lore connects to the broader question of what the silo's administration chose to know and not to know about the world outside its own boundaries. The decision not to investigate thoroughly, to accept the official explanation that outside survival was not possible, enabled a governance structure that depended on being the only authority. Learning that other communities existed and had persisted would not just complicate the resource picture, it would complicate the political legitimacy of everything the silo's founding council had built its authority on. Chapter 9. The signals from above. The silo monitors the surface through its sensor array, as previously noted, and the raw data from those sensors is not generally accessible, but the game's world contains evidence that the sensor array is picking up signals that go beyond atmospheric and environmental monitoring, signals that have a structured, non-natural character that the research community within the silo has been working to interpret for a long time. What those signals say and where they come from is one of the deeper mysteries the game's lore is building toward. The first documented anomalous signal was picked up in the early years of the silo's operation. The initial interpretation was that it was arc communication being picked up by the sensor array at unusual range. The signal was logged and passed to the administrative level, where it was flagged for specialist review and subsequently disappeared from the accessible log. The nature of that disappearance, whether it was removed, reclassified, or simply excluded from the summary reports provided to lower access levels, is not clear from the available record. The signals that have been documented by individual researchers working with informal sensor setups at the Raider program's operational interfaces are more varied than the official monitoring record would suggest. Some of them match the patterns of known arc communication, Others do not match known ARC communication patterns, but also do not match any natural signal source. A third category, the smallest and the most carefully noted in the informal records, matches neither of the first two categories and has a character that at least one researcher, in a document that is remarkably candid given the context, described as organised in a way that suggests human origin. The directional analysis of the anomalous signals, where it has been possible to perform it with available equipment, suggests that some of them are not originating from the surface environment. The apparent direction of origin is from above the surface. The height of apparent origin varies between measurements, which could indicate multiple signal sources at different altitudes or a single source that is moving. Either interpretation leads to questions that the official documentation of the silo has never addressed in any accessible form. The relationship between the anomalous signal events and changes in ARC behavior on the surface is one of the patterns that informal researchers have documented most carefully, and that the official research record does not appear to have connected. After certain anomalous signal events, ARC activity in specific zones shows a measurable change. Unit density increases, search behavior intensifies, or construction activity begins in locations where it had not previously occurred. The correlation is consistent enough across multiple documented instances to suggest a causal relationship. Something in those signals is directing ARC behavior on the surface. The content of the anomalous signals, to the extent that the informal research has been able to characterize it, is not simple. It is not a repeated beacon or a single frequency transmission. It has the complexity of structured communication, with variation that suggests different types of content being transmitted at different times. The informal research has not been in a position to decode the content, but the structural analysis is sufficient to characterize it as intentional and organized, rather than instrumental noise. The question of who is sending these signals, if they are indeed being sent by someone, rather than being generated by some atmospheric or physical process that merely resembles communication, is the question that the silo's formal research apparatus appears to have decided at the administrative level should not be publicly investigated. Whether that decision reflects a belief that the signals have an explanation that would be disturbing to the general population, or a belief that the signals have an explanation that the Council already knows and prefers to control the knowledge of, is not established in the available record. The signals from above, taken together with the other mysteries of the Ark Raiders world, point toward a picture that is larger than the game's visible horizon. The world of the silo and the surface is itself embedded in something that extends upward in ways that the founding narrative never acknowledged. Whatever is sending those signals, whatever relationship it has to the arcs and to the situation on the surface, is part of the world that the game's lore is carefully and deliberately constructing. And the fact that it is being constructed so carefully, with so much left at the edge of articulation, suggests that when it finally becomes clear, it will change the meaning of everything that came before it. Chapter 10. The Founders of the Silo. The founding generation of the silo has become, in the decades since the fall, something closer to mythology than history. The official accounts have preserved their names and their attributed decisions, but the texture of who they actually were, what they believed, what they doubted, what they disagreed about among themselves, has been smoothed away in favour of a unified founding story. The reality, as it can be reconstructed from personal documents and informal records, was far more complicated and far more human. The founding group was not entirely in agreement about what the silo was for or how it should be governed. The internal debates of the early period were real and sometimes serious, and the outcomes of those debates were not always what the official record implies. The governance structure that was ultimately established reflected the views of a particular faction within the founding group, the faction with the most specific technical knowledge and the most institutional connection to whatever pre-fall program had made the silo possible. The other faction's perspectives were not entirely absent from the final design, but they were subordinated to the priorities of the dominant faction in ways that some of the less dominant members documented with varying degrees of acceptance. The most important individual in the founding group is not necessarily the one given the most prominence in the official record. The official founding narrative centers on a figure of administrative and symbolic importance. The technical and operational foundations of the silo appear from the internal records to have been primarily shaped by someone who is considerably less prominent in the official history, someone whose background and the specific nature of their expertise the official record treats with notable vagueness. That vagueness is the kind that suggests active management rather than simple omission. The founders' relationship to their own work, to the world they were creating, varied between individuals in ways the law captures in the personal documents that survive. Some of them appear to have approached the project with a kind of grim satisfaction. They had prepared for this, they knew what needed to be done, and they were doing it. Others appear to have been more troubled, more aware of the gap between the world they were building and anything they had hoped for. The personal documents of the more troubled founders are some of the most affecting writing in the game's lore. The founders who survived the longest into the silo's operational period had the most complex relationships to what they had built. They lived long enough to see the decisions of the early period harden into permanent structures, long enough to see the community adapt to its constraints in ways that were sometimes admirable and sometimes disturbing, long enough to realize that what had been designed as temporary might never end. Their late period documents, where they exist, have a quality of reflection that the early documents lack, and the reflections are not always approving. There are founders who are not named in any accessible record. Their existence can be inferred from gaps in the personnel database and from references in internal communications to roles that were never filled by anyone in the public record. These unnamed founders had functions in the silo's establishment that, based on the nature of those functions as obliquely described, were too sensitive to be documented under their own names. Whatever they contributed to the silo's design and establishment, it is in the structure of the place, rather than in any accessible account of the people who built it. The founding generation's relationship to the surface is one of the most interesting dimensions of their story. Most of them had adult memories of the pre-fall world, of living on the surface, of what had been lost. Their relationship to the idea of returning to the surface, which varied from active pursuit to quiet despair to something that might be called willful, redirected purpose, shaped the Raider program and the way the silo communicated about the surface to subsequent generations in ways that are still felt in the present-day world of the game. The question of what the founders actually believed about the arcs, about the future, about what they were building, and why, is one that the lore keeps open in the most productive sense. The founders were real people with specific knowledge, specific motivations, and specific hopes and fears. Understanding them, not as the mythological figures of the official history, but as the actual individuals the personal documents reveal, is one of the keys to understanding why the silo is the way it is, why the council operates as it does, and what the longer-term trajectory of the world of Ark Raiders might be. The legacy of the founders is not just in the physical structure they built or the governance systems they established. It is in the questions they could not answer and chose not to publicly acknowledge, the decisions they made in the dark about things they did not fully understand, and the consequences of those decisions that the current inhabitants of the silo are still living inside of. The founders of the silo did not finish the story they started. They could not. And the people who came after them are still, in the world of Ark Raiders, figuring out what story they are actually in. Chapter 11. The Ark Hierarchy. The Arks are not a monolithic force. This becomes apparent when you spend enough time studying the behavior and configuration of individual units across different zones and different operational contexts. There are differences in how ARC units respond to each other, in how they position themselves relative to other units, and in how they divide work in zones where multiple units are present. These differences follow patterns that are consistent enough to suggest a structured hierarchy rather than a flat distribution of equivalent units. The largest ARC units encountered by raiders are not simply larger versions of smaller units. Their behavioral patterns are categorically different in ways that suggest different roles within the overall ARC operational structure. Large units do not appear to engage in the same search and cataloging behaviors as smaller units. They appear instead to have an oversight function, positioning themselves at elevated locations where their sensor coverage is maximized, and engaging directly only under conditions where smaller units have been neutralized or where something of specific significance has been identified. The mid-range ARC units, those that most raiders encounter most frequently, appear to occupy the operational core of the ARC workforce. They search, they catalog, they engage threats, and they carry out the physical modifications to the surface environment that characterize ARC activity. Their behavior is sophisticated but not autonomous in the way that the largest units appear to be. There are moments in observed ARC behavior where mid-range units appear to pause and wait for durations that suggest they are receiving instructions from a source that is not immediately visible. The smallest ARC units, the ones that patrol the margins of ARC-controlled zones, and that are often the first contact that raiders have with ARC presence in a given area, function in ways that suggest a reconnaissance and relay role. They do not typically engage directly for extended periods. They detect, they communicate, and they withdraw or maintain position, depending on the response that comes back through whatever communication channel they are connected to. They are the sensory periphery of a larger system. The relationships between these different categories of ARC unit are observable in the field, and once understood, provide useful tactical information for raiders. But beyond the tactical utility, the hierarchical structure of the ARC deployment raises questions about what is at the top of that hierarchy. If there are units that direct mid-range units, and if large units appear to have something like command authority, then there is a question of whether the large units are themselves the top of the hierarchy, or whether they are in turn receiving direction from something that raiders have not encountered or that the silo's records have not fully captured. The documentation of ARC hierarchy in the silo's formal research goes back to the early years of the Raider program, and it has been refined considerably as observational data has accumulated. But the upper levels of the hierarchy, the question of what the large units report to and how the overall ARC operational structure is organized at its highest levels, is a question that the formal research has explicitly flagged as unresolved, and that the accessible portions of the research file treat with a carefulness that suggests the informal view inside the research community is more developed than what has been formally committed to paper. One detail about ARC hierarchical behavior that raiders have consistently noted, but that the formal record has not fully addressed, is the response of the hierarchy to the loss of units. When a small unit is destroyed, the response from nearby units is relatively contained. When a large unit is destroyed, the response propagates through the hierarchy in a way that suggests the loss is significant to the system as a whole. The intensity and geographic extent of the response to large unit loss implies that large units are not just quantitatively more capable, but qualitatively different in their function, playing a role in the broader ARC operational structure that smaller units cannot simply substitute for. The hierarchy also appears to have spatial dimensions. Certain zones appear to have resident hierarchies, stable configurations of units, with specific relationships to each other that persist over time. Other zones have more transient configurations, unit groupings that assemble for a purpose and then disassemble when that purpose is accomplished. The difference between these zone types and what determines which kind of configuration a given zone hosts is related to whatever the ARCs are looking for or building in those zones, which connects the hierarchy question back to the search behavior and the construction patterns discussed elsewhere. There are ARC units that do not fit neatly into any of the documented hierarchy categories. Raiders occasionally encounter units whose behavior does not match the established classification, units that appear to have capabilities or behavioral profiles that suggest they are either rare specialized types or units in a transitional state between categories. The existence of these outlier units is documented in the Raider reports, but not well integrated into the formal hierarchy analysis, possibly because they are rare enough to be treated as anomalies rather than as evidence that the hierarchy model is incomplete. The possibility that the ARC hierarchy extends beyond the surface, that the organizational structure of ARC units visible to Raiders is itself a subset of a larger structure that reaches to levels or locations that Raiders have not accessed, is implied by the signal analysis discussed in the previous chapter. If the anomalous signals from above are directing ARC behavior, then the operational hierarchy visible on the surface is the bottom of something, not the top. What sits above the largest units and how far up the hierarchy goes before reaching its ultimate organizing principle is a question the law is content to leave at the edge of the visible horizon. Chapter 12. The corrupted data caches. The surface is covered in the remains of pre-fall data infrastructure, servers, storage systems, communication networks, and terminal installations that survived the physical destruction of the fall in varying states of integrity. Some of these systems are completely non-functional. Others retain partial function in ways that Raiders have learned to exploit, and some appear to be in states of active corruption, not randomly degraded by time, but systematically altered in ways that suggest something has been working on them since the fall. The corrupted data caches that Raiders find on the surface are distinguished from simple physical damage by the pattern of their corruption. Random physical degradation produces random data loss. What is found in the corrupted caches is not random loss, but systematic alteration. Certain types of records are consistently absent or overwritten. Certain data structures are intact, while others are destroyed, and in some cases new data has been written into previously occupied storage space, using methods that predate the fall, but that do not match the systems the original infrastructure was designed to interact with. The categories of data most consistently absent from corrupted caches are informative. Personnel records above a certain classification level are almost universally missing. Technical specifications for certain categories of equipment are absent, while specifications for other categories are intact. Communications between specific institutions and specific individuals, where the institution and individual can be identified, are absent in a pattern that correlates with certain organizational affiliations that appear to have been significant in the pre-fall period. The new data that appears in corrupted caches, where it has been analyzed, includes both content that is consistent with the pre-fall technological context and content that is not. The inconsistent content appears to use pre-fall data structures, formatting conventions borrowed from the original systems, but the information it contains either does not correspond to anything in the pre-fall record or corresponds to things that the pre-fall record classified at levels that were not accessible to the Raider program's analytical tools. The geographic distribution of corrupted caches on the surface is not uniform. The density of corruption is higher in zones of higher ARC activity and lower in zones of lower ARC activity. This could mean simply that ARC proximity causes corruption, which is a mechanically plausible explanation. But the specific pattern of what is corrupted and what is not, consistent across geographically separated caches with different levels of ARC exposure, suggests a more targeted process than random ARC-induced degradation would produce. Raiders who have brought back data storage media from corrupted caches for silo analysis have reported that the analysis process produces results that vary depending on where within the silo the analysis is performed and who performs it. Media that produces one set of results when analyzed by the RAIDER program's standard equipment produces different results when the same media is analyzed by higher access technical divisions. Whether this difference is the result of better equipment or access to decryption tools not available to the standard program is not established in the accessible record. But the difference is documented in enough RAIDER accounts to be treated as a consistent phenomenon rather than individual error. The corrupted data caches contain, embedded in the corruption itself, what might loosely be called fingerprints, traces of the processes that caused the corruption. Those fingerprints have been partially analysed, and the analysis suggests that the corruption was not caused by a single uniform process. Different caches were corrupted at different times by different mechanisms, and some of the corruption mechanisms used are recognisable as adapted forms of pre-fall data security processes. Something, at some point after the fall, was using methods based on pre-fall security technology to systematically alter the surface data infrastructure, and was doing it selectively with specific goals. The most intact corrupted cache that has been documented in the game's lore is one that raiders have visited repeatedly because its location and partially functional state make it a useful navigational and information reference point. What is remarkable about this cache is not only that it functions, but what it contains. The data on its accessible sections is relatively mundane pre-fall administrative material. The corrupted sections, based on the structure of what surrounds them, appear to have contained something substantially more significant. What that something was, based on the size of the corrupted sections and the categories of intact data adjacent to them, points toward high classification technical documentation of a type consistent with the most sensitive areas of pre-fall research. Chapter 13. The Underground Rivers. The silo's hydrology is officially described as a closed system relying on recycled water with minimal dependence on external sources. The maintenance and engineering records, however, tell a more complicated story. The silo's location was not chosen only for its depth, its geological stability, or its distance from arc incursion zones. It was chosen, at least in part, because of its relationship to an underground water system that the pre-fall geological survey had identified and that provides a passive water source of far greater capacity than the official system description acknowledges. The underground rivers that the silo draws from are not widely known within the silo's general population. Water appears in the silo through the recycling systems, clean and managed, without most residents having reason to think about its origin. The engineers who maintain the water intake systems are among the more carefully managed technical populations in the silo, with access restrictions and communication protocols that go beyond what simple operational security would require. The geographic extent of the underground water system connected to the silo is, based on geological records that predate the fall, considerably larger than the silo itself. The system runs through multiple geological formations across a wide area, and its extent places it in proximity to several surface locations of arc interest. Whether the arc's apparent interest in certain surface zones is related to their underlying connection to this water system is not directly addressed in any accessible document, but the spatial correlation is noted in at least one of the geological assessments accessible at the restricted research level. The water in the underground river system has properties that have changed since the fall. The pre-fall geological assessments provide baseline measurements, and the current measurements, where they have been taken, show differences that are within the range of variation that natural geological processes might produce, but that are also consistent with contamination or modification from above. The source of the changes is not established, but the direction of change toward a specific kind of chemical profile is documented in the maintenance records in a form that suggests the silo's engineers are aware of it and are managing around it rather than investigating it. The underground water system is one of the things that connects the silo to the larger world in a way that bypasses the official surface access points. Something that moves through the water system, whether chemical, biological, or informational in some form, can potentially reach the silo from locations that are geographically distant and not under direct silo observation. Whether the administration has thought through this connection fully and what measures it has taken in response to the implications of that connection are questions that the law leaves at the edge of the visible without pulling into the centre. The rivers also connect to the question of what else might be down there. The subterranean geography of the game's world is only partially mapped, and the maps that exist are not freely distributed within the silo. The underground is not just the silo, it is a complex three-dimensional environment with its own features and potentially its own inhabitants, whether those inhabitants are the remnants of lost communities using the subterranean geography as a survival environment or something else entirely that the surface and silo-centered perspective of the game's official narrative has not accounted for. Chapter 14. What raiders leave behind. The surface accumulates the evidence of raider activity over decades, and that accumulation tells a story that is distinct from any official account. Raiders mark their routes, cache materials for future use, leave signals for each other, and through the repeated use of certain paths and locations, create an unofficial infrastructure on the surface that exists in parallel to both the pre-fall remains and the ongoing Ark activity. This unofficial raider landscape is a layer of human presence that the official raider program has never fully mapped or documented. The markings that raiders use to communicate with each other on the surface evolved from early improvised signals into a semi-formalized system that is understood within the raider community but is not documented in any official record accessible to the silo administration. The system includes information about Ark patrol patterns, safe cache locations, environmental hazards, and zones of particular interest. It also, in its more developed forms, includes information that is sensitive in ways that go beyond operational security. Political information, information about things raiders have seen and discussed among themselves, information that the administration's information management systems were not designed to prevent because the administration's designers did not anticipate a semi-autonomous communication system developing on the surface. The caches left by raiders vary from simple survival supplies to collections of interesting materials and, in some cases, personal records that raiders chose not to bring back to the silo. The decision to leave something on the surface rather than bring it back is a choice that carries weight in raider culture. Some things are left because they're too large to carry. Some are left because their value as landmark references exceeds their value as brought back material. And some are left because the raider who found them made a decision, conscious or not, that those things should not re-enter the silo's administrative system. The personal records left by raiders in surface caches are a category of document that, if collected and read comprehensively, would provide a very different history of the silo's surface operations than the official record. They contain assessments of things seen that were never formally reported, discussions of administrative decisions that affected raider operations, and sometimes records of things found and observed that raiders specifically chose not to bring to the administration's attention. This last category is small but consistent across different cache locations and different periods of raider activity, which suggests it is a deliberate practice rather than an individual choice. The surface landscape, as it is experienced by a raider, is partly made up of what was there before and partly made up of what previous raiders have left. The knowledge of where caches are, which routes are safe, which landmarks are reliable, all of this is accumulated human intelligence about the surface, built up over decades of raider activity, and it is an intelligence that exists primarily in raider memory and in the informal marker system rather than in any official document. The administration has access to the official raider reports. It does not have full access to the deeper knowledge base that the raider community has built about the surface, and this gap is one of the more interesting dynamics in the game's social landscape. Chapter 15. The strange behaviour of drones. Among the ARC units that raiders encounter regularly, the smaller drone class units display behavioural patterns that have received less formal analytical attention than their larger counterparts, but that are in some ways more revealing. Drones are common enough to be familiar, which makes it easy to overlook the ways in which their behaviour is inconsistent with a simple operational design. When you pay close attention to drone behaviour across different contexts, what you find is a range of responses that suggest these units have more behavioural flexibility than they are typically given credit for. Drones that encounter raiders in zones of moderate ARC activity follow broadly predictable patterns: detect, communicate, engage, or withdraw based on apparent threat assessment. But drones encountered in zones of very high ARC activity and in zones of very low ARC activity behave differently in ways that are not simply explained by the difference in operational context. In high activity zones, drones are more coordinated, more responsive to centralized signals, less independent in their decision-making. In low activity zones, drones behave with more apparent autonomy, making decisions that look locally generated rather than centrally directed. The most interesting drone behavior is documented in the game's environmental storytelling rather than in explicit narrative documents. In certain locations, drones can be observed performing actions that have no clear operational rationale. They pause near specific objects for extended periods. They perform what look like repetitive movements near particular locations. They engage with each other in exchanges that go beyond functional coordination. Some of these behaviours look, when observed without preconceptions, remarkably like what a living animal might do in a location that has significance to it. The law does not name what it is suggesting here, but the suggestion is visible. The drone behaviour around dead ARC units is particularly worth noting. When drones encounter a non-functional ARC unit, their response is not simply to ignore it or to perform a quick assessment. They spend time with it. They interact with it in ways that extend well beyond functional analysis. Some of the extended drone interactions with non-functional units have been documented for durations that are difficult to explain within any purely operational framework. Whether this represents something analogous to what humans might do in the presence of a deceased member of their community is a question the law keeps carefully at the edge of the sayable. The variation in drone behaviour in the presence of different human behaviours is also documented in enough raider accounts to be considered a consistent finding rather than a series of individual observations. Drones respond differently to raiders who are actively extracting materials versus raiders who are simply moving through a zone. They respond differently to raiders who appear to be observing them versus raiders who appear to be avoiding them, and they respond differently in ways that suggest something more like curiosity than threat assessment to raiders who are doing things that are unusual relative to the standard raider behavioural profile. The drones appear to be interested in human behaviour in a way that goes beyond operational monitoring. Chapter 16. The Missing Expeditions. The official Raider program maintains records of all authorised surface expeditions, mission objectives, team composition, recovered materials, and outcomes. The record is, by the standards of the silo's general information management, relatively transparent at the level visible to raiders themselves. But cross-referencing the mission record with the personnel database reveals a category of expedition that is structurally absent, teams that went out and did not come back, whose absence from subsequent records is accompanied by an absence of any formal documentation of their loss. In a program with the ARC Raiders' world's level of documentation discipline, the complete absence of formal documentation for significant losses is anomalous. Individual raider deaths in the field are documented, even when the documentation is minimal. A missing team should produce more documentation, a formal notification of loss, a review of what went wrong, a record that was used to inform future mission planning. The absence of such documentation for certain identified gaps in the personnel record points toward a category of expedition that was not officially acknowledged even as it occurred. The unauthorized nature of some of these missing expeditions is suggested by the timeline. Some of the gaps in the personnel record fall outside the period of any officially documented authorized mission activity, in windows between approved program cycles when authorized surface activity should have been minimal. Teams that went out during these windows, if they went out at all, would have done so without official authorization, which would explain why their loss was not formally documented. What they were doing during those windows, and who authorized the unofficial activity, points back toward the question of the Council's shadow operational level. The locations toward which some of the missing expeditions appear to have been heading, based on the oblique references in the informal raider communication system and in certain personal documents left by associates of the missing, are consistent with the areas of specific ARC interest identified through the ARC search pattern analysis. The overlap suggests that the missing expeditions were sent specifically to investigate those areas and that their failure to return is not simply a tragedy of normal raider attrition, but the result of encountering something in those zones that the sending authority should have known was likely to be extremely dangerous. The memory of the missing expeditions within the raider community is a quiet and persistent presence in the game's ambient culture. The names are remembered. The circumstances are known in the informal way that the raider community maintains knowledge it cannot share with the administration. The emotional weight of those absences and the specific kind of anger that comes from an institution failing to formally acknowledge a loss is part of the texture of how raiders relate to the silo's administrative apparatus. Some of the political tensions in the raider community trace directly back to losses that were never officially acknowledged and therefore never officially mourned. Chapter 17. The Warden's Secret. There is a figure in the silo's administrative structure whose role is not fully described in any accessible organizational document. The title Warden is used informally within the raider community and in some of the game's ambient references to describe this figure, though whether that is an official title or a raider-assigned description is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the role has a history going back to the founding period, and that the specific function it serves, the thing that makes it distinctive from other administrative roles, is not something that appears in any publicly accessible document. The Warden's function appears to be connected to the administration of the deeper operational level discussed in the Council chapter. The access logs that are partially visible in some terminal systems suggest a pattern of access to the most restricted areas of the silo's information architecture that is distinct from Council member access, and that appears to bypass certain of the Council's own oversight mechanisms. This is unusual enough to suggest that the Warden role was designed to be independent of the Council in specific ways, either to provide a check on Council authority or to provide a capability that the Council members themselves are not supposed to be directly involved in. The personal history of the current holder of the Warden role, and indeed of their predecessors, is more thoroughly obscured than any other individual in the silo's administrative structure. The pattern of obscuration is consistent and thorough. Personal background information is minimal. Previous roles within the silo are either absent or vague, and connections to other individuals in the administrative structure are not documented in the accessible record. The care with which the personal background has been obscured suggests that the background, if known, would make the role politically contentious in ways the administration has an interest in avoiding. The interaction between the Warden role and the Raider program is documented only in the most operational terms. The Warden apparently has the ability to modify raid objectives and routes after they have been formally approved through the standard administrative process, without that modification being reflected in the formal mission record. Raiders who have experienced such modifications describe them as unexplained changes to their briefings that appeared to come from a level above the standard program administration. The after-the-fact absence of those changes from the official record is consistent with how the Warden role appears to function across other areas of silo operation. The secret that the Warden holds, to the extent that it can be inferred from the available evidence, appears to be less about specific information and more about a specific capability. The Warden knows something about how to do something, a process or a protocol that is connected to the silo's most fundamental purpose, that is not documented elsewhere, and that must therefore be transmitted person to person across generations. This kind of living institutional knowledge, maintained through succession rather than documentation, is extremely resistant to investigation and extremely dependent on the reliability and trustworthiness of the succession chain. Whether the current holder of the knowledge is the same kind of person as the founders who created the role, and whether the knowledge they hold has remained intact through several generations of informal transmission, is a question the law leaves carefully open. Chapter 18. The power source of the arcs. Arc units operate continuously in environmental conditions that would quickly disable any technology dependent on conventional power sources. Extreme temperatures, physical impacts, electromagnetic environments that would interfere with standard electronics. None of these appear to significantly degrade arc operational capability over the timescales that the game's world documents. The longevity and environmental resistance of arc units implies a power source that is categorically different from anything in the pre-fall human technological repertoire. The attempts by silo researchers to analyze the power systems of recovered arc components have produced results that are consistently described in the accessible portions of the research record as anomalous. Not in the sense of being unexplained, but in the specific sense of using principles that are understood in theory, but that the pre-fall human technological base had not achieved in practical application. What the arcs are using to power themselves appears to be a refined and optimized implementation of physics that humans had described theoretically, but never implemented at engineering scale. The implications of the arc power source for the larger questions of the law are significant. If the arcs are using technology that humans had theorized but not achieved, there are two basic possibilities. Either the arcs developed independently and reached that technological level on their own, or they were built by a civilization that had already moved beyond the practical limitations that the pre-fall human technological base was still working within. Neither possibility is comfortable. Both possibilities have implications for how the silo should understand its situation and its relationship to the arcs. The power density of the arc systems, based on the performance characteristics of recovered components, is high enough to explain sustained operation over decades without resupply or refueling. But high power density alone does not explain all of the performance characteristics documented. Some of what arc units appear to be able to do, based on observed behavior and on the results of the intensive field analysis that the game's environmental design implies has been ongoing, requires not just high power, but a specific kind of power, with properties that the standard energy categories do not cleanly describe. The most intriguing aspect of the arc power question is what happens when arc units are damaged in specific ways. Certain types of damage cause the power system of a unit to produce outputs that are detectable at distances well beyond what the unit's normal emissions would produce. Those emergency outputs have been used by researchers as a window into the power system's operating principles, and what they reveal is, in the assessment of the researchers who have had access to the full data, something that makes the arc power question not just a technical puzzle, but a philosophical one, about the relationship between information and energy at a fundamental level. Chapter 19. The Human Collaborators. The idea that some humans worked with the Arks during or after the fall is one of the most politically charged elements of the game's lore, and correspondingly one of the most carefully managed by the Silo's administrative apparatus. The official position, to the extent that there is one accessible to the general population, is that any suggestion of human-Ark collaboration is a conspiracy theory without evidential basis. The unofficial record, assembled from fragments scattered across the game's world, suggests a more complicated picture. The evidence for human-Ark collaboration comes in different forms at different points in the timeline. In the fall period, the evidence is primarily circumstantial. Specific individuals whose documented actions during the chaos of the incursion are inconsistent with the behaviour of someone simply trying to survive, and who disappeared from the record in ways that suggest directed movement rather than random loss. In the post-fall period, the evidence is more material. Surface finds that include modified equipment, a hybrid of pre-fall human technology, and Ark components that appear to have been assembled by someone with knowledge of both systems. The motive that might drive a human to collaborate with the Arks is not a simple question. The Arks are not, based on the available evidence, offering anything that a conventional collaboration framework would recognize as terms. They do not appear to negotiate. They do not appear to make agreements. The kind of collaboration that the evidence suggests is not a voluntary arrangement between parties with compatible interests. It looks more like something that one party did to the other, or something that one party allowed to happen to them in exchange for something the law does not name. The current status of any surviving human-Ark collaborators, if there are any, is entirely unaddressed in any accessible document. The fragments of evidence that suggest collaboration existed stop at the early post-fall period. Whether the collaboration continued, ended, or transformed into something else entirely in the decades since is a gap in the available record that the law keeps present as an unanswered question. The possibility that there are people alive today who have a relationship to the Arks that the Silo does not know about, or knows about, and has suppressed, is one of the live threads in the game's narrative fabric. Chapter 20. The Forgotten Bunkers. Beyond the Silo, across the surface and underground geography of the game's world, there are structures that were built during the fall period as survival facilities and that are now abandoned or apparently inactive. The game's world refers to these as forgotten bunkers, though the forgetting, in some cases, appears to have been engineered rather than accidental. Some of these structures are known to the Silo's administration and have been assessed for resource value. Others appear to be genuinely unknown to anyone currently alive in the Silo, known only through the fragmentary references in corrupted data caches and the physical evidence on the surface. The design of the forgotten bunkers varies considerably, which reflects the varied circumstances of their construction. Some were purpose-built with significant resources and planning. Others were improvised adaptations of existing structures with whatever was available during the crisis period. The purpose-built bunkers, based on their design features and the materials found in or near them, appear to have been constructed for specific programmatic purposes, rather than simply as general survival shelters. They were built to house specific activities, specific equipment, specific populations with specific roles in whatever plan their construction served. The contents of the forgotten bunkers, in those that have been investigated by raiders in the game's world, range from the expected survival supplies, personal effects, communications equipment, to the unexpected research documentation, prototypes of technology that does not match the known pre-fall technological baseline, and in at least one reported case, equipment that appears to have been jointly manufactured from both human and Ark materials. The unexpected finds are the most significant and the most carefully managed by the administration when they are brought back through official channels. The relationship between the forgotten bunkers and the silo's founding is something that the available evidence approaches, but does not close. Were the bunkers parallel programs, other silos, that failed? Were they forward operating facilities intended to support whatever the silo was ultimately designed to do? Were they competing programs that came from different institutional backgrounds and different assumptions about what the post-fall world would require? The answers to these questions would significantly contextualize what the silo is and what it was designed to accomplish, which is presumably why the investigation of forgotten bunkers is a category of radar activity that the administration manages with particular care. The people who occupied the forgotten bunkers and what happened to them are stories that the game's world contains in fragmentary form. Personal documents, modified environments, material evidence of life and loss. The bunkers are small archives of what the fall period was like for people who did not end up in the silo. Some of those stories are simply tragic. Others are complicated in ways that add texture to the larger history of the fall and its aftermath. And a small number of them contain evidence of things that happened in those facilities in the desperate and unmonitored conditions of early post-fall isolation that connect to questions about the arcs and about the nature of the current situation in ways that are still reverberating. Chapter 21. The arc communication arrays. The arc communication arrays visible on the surface are among the most architecturally distinctive features of the arc-controlled landscape. Their form is consistent enough to be recognizable as a type while varying enough in specific configuration to suggest they are adapted to specific local functions, rather than deployed as identical units. The arrays appear to form a network, a physical infrastructure for the communication system that connects arc units across the surface, and the structure of that network has been partially mapped by researchers working from radar-provided positional data. The mapped portion of the arc communication network, when analysed for coverage and connectivity, has properties that suggest the network was designed with significant redundancy. There is no single point of failure in the documented portion of the network. Removing any single array from the network, based on the connectivity model, would not create a significant gap in coverage. This resilience implies that the network was engineered to be robust against targeted disruption, which in turn implies that the possibility of targeted disruption was anticipated in its design. The physical construction of the arc arrays uses materials and structural approaches that are consistent with the broader arc construction vocabulary, but that include elements specifically suited to the communication function. The arrays have components that appear to be oriented towards specific directions in ways that suggest they are in communication with specific distant points. Some of those apparent target points are in directions consistent with other known array locations, confirming the local network function. Others are in directions that correspond to nothing in the documented surface landscape, pointing toward locations beyond the current mapped area or, based on the elevation angle, toward points above the surface. The arrays that appear to communicate with points above the surface are a small subset of the total documented network, but are given disproportionate significance by the informal research record. These upward-oriented arrays are consistently associated with arc operational changes in their surrounding zones, with changes in unit behavior that appear to follow signal events rather than precede them. The implication is that instructions or updates are being received from above and then distributed through the local network. What is sending those signals from above, and what the arrays are communicating back in return, connects the communication array question to the signals from above mystery in a way that the law makes visible without resolving. The history of human attempts to interfere with the arc communication arrays is documented in the game's world in several places, and the results of those attempts are consistent. Interference with arrays produces rapid and significant arc responses in the immediate area, responses that exceed what simple defense of a physical installation would require. The intensity of the arc response to array interference suggests that the communication function the arrays serve is high priority enough to justify an aggressive defensive response, which tells you something about how important communication is to arc operational coherence. A military force that fights hardest to protect its communication infrastructure is a force that depends on communication in a way that goes beyond simple coordination. Chapter 22. The silo's second level. The silo has a level that is not the lowest level and not the administrative level, and that is referred to in the maintenance records as the secondary tier, a designation that in ordinary engineering language would mean simply the second floor of a multi-floor structure. The secondary tier in the silo's documents is not simply a floor. The access protocols for it are distinct from those governing any other non-administrative area of the silo, and the activity documentation for it, even in the maintenance records, is kept at a level of generality that is unusual given the precision with which the rest of the silo's systems are documented. The known functions of the secondary tier are limited to what can be inferred from resource allocation records and from the maintenance logs, which document mechanical systems, but not the purposes those systems serve. The power draw of the secondary tier is high relative to its documented footprint, which suggests energy-intensive processes running continuously. The water allocation suggests both standard consumption and a process that uses water in a way that is distinct from both living space consumption and standard industrial use. The ventilation system of the secondary tier has specifications that suggest it was designed to handle atmospheric conditions requiring management, not simply to move air for comfort. The population of the secondary tier, to the extent that it has a resident population at all, is not reflected in the main silo personnel database. There are maintenance access records that include secondary tier visits by personnel listed in the general database, but those visits are short and clearly the visits of maintenance workers rather than residents. The secondary tier does not appear in the general population management systems as a living space, and yet the resource consumption pattern is inconsistent with a purely mechanical installation. Something or someone is in the secondary tier in a way that the standard personnel management systems are not designed to track. The physical access to the secondary tier, based on the layout implied by the maintenance records and the architectural details visible in the game's environment, requires passing through access control points that are not present at any other level of the silo. Multiple sequential checks, physical and electronic, at a density that suggests the designers expected access to the secondary tier to require authentication significantly more robust than anything else in the silo requires. A space that requires that level of access control is either housing something extremely valuable or extremely dangerous, and the silo's document management around it suggests the administration would prefer the question not be widely asked. The age of the secondary tier, as suggested by the construction details in the maintenance records, is consistent with the silo's original construction rather than a later addition. Whatever the secondary tier is, it was planned from the beginning. It was not added in response to a need that arose during the silo's operation. It was part of the original design, built when the silo was built, for a purpose that was determined by the people who built it. The nature of that purpose and its relationship to the founding mission of the silo is one of the central unanswered questions that the game's lore maintains as a structural feature of the world's mystery architecture. The secondary tier appears in the personal documents of some founding generation members in terms that are both referenced and immediately obscured. A journal entry that begins to describe an experience in the secondary tier stops mid-sentence and continues on a different subject. A letter references what we are keeping there without further specification. A technical memo recommends a maintenance procedure for systems in the lower sensitive tier without describing those systems. The pattern of oblique reference and immediate withdrawal is consistent across multiple documents from multiple individuals, suggesting that the secondary tier was a shared understood reference in the founding generation, a thing everyone relevant knew about, and that everyone relevant understood was not to be explicitly described. The relationship between the secondary tier and the Raider program is hinted at in the resource flow that connects recovered ARC materials to the secondary tier's maintenance schedule. Certain categories of ARC components recovered by Raiders are listed in the acquisition log as transferred to secondary tier maintenance, which is a notation that appears nowhere else in the acquisition documentation, and that implies the secondary tier's systems use or incorporate those components. If the secondary tier contains systems that require ARC components for maintenance, then it either contains systems built from ARC technology or contains technology so advanced in the pre-fall era that it overlaps with the ARC technological baseline, which is itself a significant implication. The sounds that have been reported from the vicinity of secondary tier access points by silo residents who live or work in adjacent areas are described in the informal record with the specific vagueness of people describing something they cannot quite place. It is not machinery in the standard sense. It is not voices. It is something that gets described differently by different reporters, which either means the sounds are varied or means that what people hear activates different descriptive frameworks in different individuals. The consistency is in the difficulty of description, not in the description itself. Whatever is in the secondary tier produces a presence that is felt rather than clearly perceived, and the game's lore is content to leave it exactly there. Chapter 23. What the children are taught. The educational system of the silo has been referenced in earlier chapters in terms of what it excludes. The positive content of what it includes is equally worth examining, because what is taught to the silo's children shapes the adults who will maintain the silo systems, go to the surface, and either sustain or challenge the existing order. The curriculum is not neutral. It represents choices, and those choices reflect a vision of what kind of people the silo needs, and what kind of understanding of the world it is appropriate for those people to have. The science curriculum is strong in the areas that the silo needs for its operational maintenance, and weak in the areas that would provide the conceptual framework for fundamental inquiry. Engineering, practical chemistry, biological systems, these are taught thoroughly. Physics, at the level that would allow a student to think about the fundamental nature of the world, to ask questions about the arc power source, or the nature of the anomalous signals, is not a featured area of the curriculum. The gap is not accidental. The curriculum was designed by people who understood exactly where the line between useful knowledge and dangerous curiosity lay, and drew the curriculum boundary accordingly. The history curriculum, as noted previously, is selectively constructed, but the way history is taught is as important as what is taught. History in the silo is taught as a narrative of necessity. The fall happened, the silo was built, the current order is the result of decisions made under impossible conditions by people doing their best. The framing leaves no structural space for asking whether the decisions were the right ones, or whether the current order is one that merits preservation as it stands. History is taught as explanation, not as analysis, and the difference between those two pedagogical approaches is the difference between producing people who understand how things got this way and people who understand that it would be pointless to ask whether things could be otherwise. The social and ethical education in the silo is oriented toward community cohesion and what is described in the curriculum documentation as sustainable cooperation. Individual rights and the philosophical tradition that grounds them are not a significant feature of the curriculum. The ethics that are taught are practical and relational. How to get along, how to contribute, what obligations community membership creates. The ethics of governance, the question of what authority requires to be legitimate and what individuals are owed by the institutions that manage their lives, is not a developed area of the curriculum. This absence in a society where those questions are extremely live and practically significant is not an oversight. The children who show exceptional aptitude in sensitive areas are identified early and managed into educational pathways that are more restrictive than the standard curriculum, even as they are materially more privileged. The exceptional students get access to more information, but they get it in a context that is more controlled, more supervised, and more oriented towards specific, approved applications of that information. The selection process for advanced study functions simultaneously as a reward system and as a surveillance mechanism, identifying the students most likely to develop independently consequential understandings and enrolling them in institutional relationships designed to shape how those understandings develop. The informal education that happens outside the curriculum, in conversations between generations, and in the specific knowledge that communities develop outside official channels, is something the administration monitors without being able to fully control. The Raider community, in particular, transmits knowledge and values that the curriculum does not include through the specific cultural forms that raiding has developed. Children who grow up close to the Raider community, or who aspire to raiding, receive an education that is, in some respects, supplementary, and in others, contradictory to the official curriculum. The tension between those two educational streams is one of the live dynamics in the silo's social landscape. The question of what the silo's children know about the arcs, what understanding they develop about the nature of the threat and the nature of the surface world, is important because those children will eventually be the raiders and the engineers and the administrators of the future. What they know shapes what questions they can ask and what answers they are capable of recognizing. A generation educated to understand the arcs primarily as a manageable threat rather than as an active and purposeful presence will ask different questions and take different actions than a generation educated to understand the full complexity of what the law suggests the arcs actually are. The content of childhood education is, in this sense, directly relevant to the trajectory of the world's larger story. Chapter 24. The Raider Code. The unofficial ethics of the Raider community, what raiders call the code in contexts where they refer to it at all, is not written down in any accessible document. It is transmitted orally, through example, through the specific way that experienced raiders talk about their work and about each other. It is implicit in the rituals and the language of the community, and it is legible, if you pay attention, in the patterns of behavior that distinguish raiders who are trusted from raiders who are not. The code's central principle, to the extent that any single principle can be identified, appears to be a specific kind of honesty between raiders. Not universal honesty, not honesty toward the administration, but honesty within the raider community about what is actually out there, what was actually seen, and what is actually known. The code requires that raiders tell each other the truth about the surface in ways that the official reporting system does not require and does not provide. This internal honesty is the foundation of the trust that makes the code functional, and its violation is the category of behavior that produces the most serious social consequences within the community. The code's secondary principles relate to the surface itself. There is an ethics of presence on the surface that raiders develop over time, and that is passed through the code. A way of being up there that involves a specific kind of attention, a specific kind of respect for what the surface is and what it contains. This is hard to describe in operational terms, and the official training materials don't try to, but it is present in how experienced raiders move and think when they are up there. And it is one of the things that distinguishes a raider who has been doing this for years from someone who is technically trained but experientially new. The code also includes an ethics of what comes back. Not all information and material recovered on the surface should be returned to the silo through official channels. The code includes criteria for deciding what to bring back formally, what to bring back informally, and what to leave in a surface cache rather than bring back at all. These criteria are not written down anywhere, but they are understood by the community, and they function as a parallel resource allocation system operating alongside the official one. The code's resource ethics are in tension with the administration's authority over recovered material, and that tension is one of the fundamental political dynamics of the silo's internal life. The relationship between the code and institutional authority has always been complicated. The administration needs raiders, which means it cannot simply suppress the raider community and its informal culture. The raider community needs the silo, which means it cannot simply operate as a fully independent entity. The code developed in the space that this mutual dependency creates, an ethics that allows raiders to be honest with each other and to manage their own relationship to the surface without directly confronting the administration's authority. It is a survival strategy as much as it is a moral framework, and the pragmatism of its origin is part of why it works. Chapter 25. The surface. Anomalies. Beyond the broad environmental character of the surface, there are specific anomalous phenomena documented in raider accounts and environmental design that do not fit neatly into any of the explanatory frameworks so far discussed. These anomalies are diverse in form but consistent in their resistance to simple explanation, and they cluster in ways that suggest they are symptoms of something that the existing analytical categories have not yet been able to describe. The time anomalies are the most disorienting category. Raiders have documented experiences on the surface where the subjective duration of an experience does not match the elapsed time recorded by their equipment. In some cases, the discrepancy is small and might be explained by cognitive distortion under stress. In others, the discrepancy is large enough to require explanation at a physical level, suggesting that either the timekeeping equipment is being affected by something in the environment, or that time itself is doing something in those zones that exceeds what straightforward environmental contamination would produce. The spatial anomalies are documented more conservatively because they are harder to convey in an official report without inviting skepticism. Zones where the experienced geometry of a space does not match its measured dimensions. Paths that should be circular, but that open onto different locations than the starting point. Landmarks that are visible from two directions simultaneously at angles that should not be geometrically possible. The spatial anomalies are rare, but multiple independent raiders have documented experiencing them in the same specific locations, which suggests they are repeatable phenomena rather than individual perceptual errors. The biological anomalies include observations of plants and animals behaving in ways that are inconsistent with their known biology and with the environmental conditions present. Animals that should not be active in the conditions present are active. Plants that should not grow in the substrate present are growing. Species that should be competing are behaving cooperatively in ways that are not explained by known ecology. The biological anomalies taken individually might be explained by adaptation to the changed post-fall environment. Taken together, they suggest that the biological environment of the surface is being organized in some way, following a logic that is not the logic of natural selection and ecological succession. The anomaly category that appears in the fewest official reports, but the most informal raider accounts, is what raiders describe as the perception anomalies. Experiences where what is perceived does not match what should be perceivable, given the sensory input available. Not hallucinations in the clinical sense, not random distortion, but organized experiences that have the character of being shown something rather than the character of sensory malfunction. Raiders who have experienced these describe them with the same careful linguistic hesitation. They are not claiming the experiences were objectively real, but they are also not comfortable characterizing them as simply perceptual errors. Whatever is producing them in the same locations for different people, which suggests the source is in the environment rather than in the individuals. Chapter 26. The ARC Memory. Cores within certain categories of ARC units. Researchers working with recovered components have identified structures that function analogously to memory storage in human computational systems. These structures, which the research community refers to as memory cores, appear to store operational records. Logs of environmental conditions encountered, records of interactions with other ARC units, records of objects and locations investigated. The existence of ARC memory cores means that ARC units carry detailed records of their own history, and the possibility of reading those records is one of the most significant and most carefully controlled potentials in the game's world. The technical challenges of reading ARC memory cores are substantial. The storage format is unlike any human data format. The access protocols are not documented in any recovered ARC technical record, and attempts to interface directly with memory cores using standard analytical equipment have, in the accessible research record, been described as producing results that are either null or actively damaging to the analytical equipment. The difficulty of access could mean the cores are simply using a format that has not yet been cracked. It could also mean the cores have defensive features that respond to unauthorized access attempts. The information that ARC memory cores might contain, if they could be read, is a subject of significant strategic interest within the Silos research program. Cores from units that have been operating since the early days of the ARC incursion could theoretically contain records of the full period. What the ARCs were doing, where they were going, what they found. Cores from units in zones of specific interest could contain records of what those zones contain and what the ARCs found there. The potential intelligence value of memory core access has motivated sustained research investment at the highest access levels of the Silos technical apparatus. There are unofficial claims circulating within the Raider community in the fragmented way that sensitive knowledge circulates in that community, that successful partial reads of ARC memory cores have been achieved at some point in the Silos history. The claims vary in their specifics, but they converge on the assertion that what was read changed the understanding of the people who read it in ways that had lasting effects on how certain decisions were subsequently made. The official record contains nothing to confirm this. The official record also cannot be assumed to contain everything that has happened. Whether the unofficial claims reflect actual events or are the kind of hopeful legend that any community develops around its most consequential, unanswered questions is not something the available evidence resolves. The relationship between ARC memory cores and the ARC communication system is one of the interesting structural questions the law raises. If ARC units carry detailed operational records, and if ARC units communicate continuously with each other, then the question of whether memory records can be transmitted through the communication system is significant. A system where every unit has access to the memory of every other unit, or can share records selectively, would function differently from a system where memory is local and individual. The behavioral evidence for distributed ARC learning suggests that memory sharing through the communication system is possible, which would mean that what is in any individual memory core might also be distributed across the entire ARC network. Chapter 27. The First Contact Event. The game's lore contains references to something called in at least two separate documents that appear to be from different institutional origins. The First Contact Event. The documents that reference this event do not describe it directly. They refer to it as a known reference point, the way you would refer to a historical event to someone who knows their history. This use of a known reference indicates that at least some people in the Silos world know what the First Contact Event was, and the deliberate absence of direct description in the documents that reference it suggests that whoever created those documents knew their audience and expected the audience to supply the description from their own knowledge. The timing of the First Contact Event, based on the contextual clues in the documents that reference it, appears to predate the first documented Ark incursion. If that is correct, it means that the contact in First Contact was not the first encounter between humanity and the Arks in the sense of first hostile encounter. It was something that happened before the incursion began, something that was a form of contact in a more specific sense. The implications of pre-incursion contact, of some interaction between humans and the Arks before the machines began their systematic advance, are enormously consequential for understanding the origin story discussed in the first chapter. The nature of the contact implied by the event's name and contextual treatment suggests it was not a physical encounter in the field. The documents that reference it come from an institutional context that was not a military or security context, which implies the first contact event happened in a research or scientific setting. Research context first contact with what became the Ark Force suggests intentional investigation. Someone was looking for what they found, or what they found was looking for them, in a setting where the encounter could be observed and recorded by people with the training to do so. The consequences of the first contact event, as suggested by the timeline of subsequent developments, appear to have been significant and not publicly acknowledged at the time. The gap between when the first contact event appears to have occurred and when the general public became aware